Tonight, we're diving into the complete history of Lord Voldemort, from Tom Riddle to the Dark Lord. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now, back to the video. Imagine a shadow that did not fall upon the wizarding world all at once, but crept across it slowly over decades, like a tide of cold darkness rising inch by inch against a shore that had no idea what was coming. Imagine that the source of that shadow was not some ancient monster born in the deep places of the earth, not some creature conjured by rival sorcerers in the age of myth, but a boy, a small, pale, dark-eyed boy who grew up in an ordinary London orphanage during the years of the Second World War, who looked out from the windows of that grey building at a grey world and decided with a clarity that most people never achieve about anything, that he would never be ordinary, never be powerless, and never, under any circumstances, allow himself to die. We often think of Lord Voldemort as simply the villain of the Harry Potter story, the dark figure lurking behind every threat and shadow, the name that most witches and wizards refused to speak for 2 decades out of pure terror. But the true story is so much more complex than that, and so much older, and so much stranger. The real narrative begins not on the night of October the 31st, 1981, when the curse rebounded in a cottage in Godric's Hollow. It begins in the 16th century, with a witch and a muggle and a doomed love, and it winds through blood and obsession and the invention of magic's darkest abominations, before it ever arrives at that orphanage, at that boy, at that terrible choice he made when he was still a child, to pursue power above all other things. What made Tom Riddle into Lord Voldemort? What turned a gifted, brilliant wizard into something that could no longer be called fully human? How did one man come so close to destroying an entire civilization? And what did it cost the wizarding world to finally bring him down? These are the questions we will answer tonight, in full, from the very beginning. We begin in the 16th century, in the village of Little Hangleton, in a county of rolling English hills and quiet farmland, where the seeds of everything that followed were planted in an act of magic so cowardly, so morally ruinous, that it would echo through 5 centuries of time. Picture the village of Little Hangleton as it was in the 1500s. It is small, as such villages always are, a cluster of thatched cottages and muddy lanes winding between fields, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's name and everyone else's business. On a hill above the village, there stands the large, handsome house of the Gaunt family, who are, in their own minds at least, people of considerable importance. The Gaunts are pure-blood wizards, and not merely pure blood in the casual sense that some families claim, but pure blood in the most extreme and obsessive sense, practitioners of a lineage philosophy so rigid and so ancient that it had come to define every aspect of how they understood themselves and their place in the world. The Gaunts believed themselves to be the last direct descendants of Salazar Slytherin himself, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the great Slytherin who had built the Chamber of Secrets beneath the school, who had championed the supremacy of magical blood above all else, and who had left behind a legacy of pride so fierce it bordered on mania. And the Gaunts had maintained that bloodline with a dedication so absolute that it had, over the centuries, become their destruction. Generations of cousin marriages and family unions kept the blood pure, but depleted everything else. The fortune, the health, the sanity. By the time we enter their story in the early 20th century, the Gaunts were a family in catastrophic decline, living in a decrepit cottage that had once been a manor house, surrounded by filth and poverty, and a barely suppressed fury at the world that had, in their view, failed to recognize their greatness. But let us go back a little further, to that 16th century moment, to trace the exact shape of the inheritance that would eventually produce Tom Riddle. Among the Gaunt family's most prized possessions, passed down with reverence through those generations, were two objects of extraordinary magical significance. The first was a golden locket engraved with a serpentine letter S, which had once belonged to Salazar Slytherin himself. The second was a plain gold ring set with a black stone, a stone that appeared unremarkable to ordinary eyes, but which, as we will eventually discover, contained within it one of the most powerful and terrible objects in the entire history of magic. These objects were not merely heirlooms. They were proof in the minds of the Gaunts of who they were, of their place in a hierarchy that they believed the rest of the wizarding world had abandoned, but that they, at least, still honored. When you have nothing else, when the money is gone and the house is falling apart and your children grow up thin and cruel and frightened, these objects become everything. And so the Gaunts clung to them with a ferocity that was almost religious. Now we must step forward to the 1920s, to the specific generation of Gaunts that concerns our story. The head of the family at this time is a man named Marvolo Gaunt, a short-tempered, contemptuous, imperious man who wears the gold ring on his finger like a declaration of war against the world's indifference, and who keeps the locket of Slytherin locked away as if it were the crown jewels of a kingdom only he can see. He has 2 children. His son is named Morphin, a young man as warped as a tree grown in darkness, who speaks almost exclusively in Parseltongue, and whose primary hobby is hexing muggles, the non-magical people who live in the village below. His daughter is named Merope, and she is the one who matters most to our story, though not because she is powerful or proud or decisive. She is none of those things. She is small and plain and meek and miserable, cowered by her father and bullied by her brother, living in a poverty and isolation so complete that the outside world might as well not exist. She has barely been educated, barely socialized, and her magical abilities, suppressed by fear and misery, are so unreliable that she might almost be mistaken for a squib. Almost. Because somewhere inside Merup Gaunt, there is enough magic to do one catastrophic thing. The object of Merup's catastrophic magic is a young man named Tom Riddle, a muggle who lives in the large house just down the hill from the Gaunt cottage. A handsome, easy-natured young man from a wealthy local family who rides his horse along the lane beneath the Gaunt family's window with a regularity that has, in Merope's solitary and desperate inner world, become the central event of her days. She is in love with him, or what passes for love, when a person has never been given any tools, with which to understand other people. She has never spoken to him. He does not know she exists, and when her father and her brother are imprisoned in Azkaban for assaulting a Ministry of Magic official who came to investigate their behavior toward Muggles, Merope finds herself alone for the first time in her life, with no one to frighten her and no one to stop her, and she does something that the wizarding world's moral philosophers would spend decades debating the precise nature of. She uses a love potion on Tom Riddle. She doses him with amortentia, or something very like it, and the handsome young muggle from down the hill, who would never have looked twice at Merope Gaunt, finds himself enchanted, besotted, following her willingly to London, where they marry. In the next chapter, you will discover exactly what became of this union, what child it produced, and why the circumstances of that child's conception would leave a mark on his very soul that no magic could ever fully erase. But first, understand what Merope has done, because the moral weight of it is enormous, and Albus Dumbledore would later argue that it explains more about Lord Voldemort than almost anything else. She has used magic to compel the love of someone who did not and could not choose her freely. And when you compel love, you do not create love. You create its perfect simulation, indistinguishable from the outside, hollow at the center. The child of such a union, Dumbledore suggested, might be unable to understand love, might be incapable of it, born already at a deficit from the very first moment of his existence, not because of the magic that runs in his veins, but because of the magic that created the conditions of his conception. This is where it all begins, not with a prophecy, not with a dark mark, not with a wand raised in anger. It begins with a potion slipped into a cup and a lie told to a heart that never had a chance. The marriage of Merope Gaunt and Tom Riddle Sr. lasted approximately a year, and it ended not with an argument or a revelation, but with a disappearance. Picture the scene as Dumbledore reconstructed it from his investigations years later. Merope, somewhere during that year, either stopped administering the potion to her husband or chose to stop, hoping perhaps, in some tender and desperate part of herself, that his feelings for her had become real enough to endure without magical reinforcement. Or perhaps because she was already pregnant and could not bring herself to continue the deception any longer. The potion wore off. Tom Riddle Sr., suddenly and bewilderingly free of whatever enchantment had held him, looked at his wife, at the shabby rented rooms they shared, at the life he had somehow stumbled into, and experienced the full force of what he actually felt, which was nothing. No love, no attachment, no understanding of how he came to be there. He left. He simply left, went back to Little Hangleton, back to his fine house on the hill, and told anyone who asked that he had been hoodwinked, that there had been enchantments involved, and that he wanted no part of it. And Merope was left alone in London, pregnant, penniless, and bereft of the only delusion that had sustained her. She did not seek help. She did not contact the wizarding world, did not go to a hospital or a shelter, or any of the dozens of places that might have offered her something. She dragged herself through the last months of her pregnancy in conditions of extreme privation, and on the 31st of December, 1926, she appeared on the doorstep of a Muggle orphanage called Wool's Orphanage in London, and gave birth to a son. She named him Tom after his father, a Marvolo after her own father, and Riddle, the surname of the man who had abandoned her, a name that would later prove more apt than anyone could have imagined, because Tom Marvolo Riddle was, in almost every sense, a riddle that the wizarding world would spend decades trying and failing to solve. And then Merope Gaunt died. She died within the hour of her son's birth, too weakened by poverty and grief and malnourishment to survive, and she left behind a child who had never been held by a mother, never heard his name spoken with tenderness, never felt the particular safety of being wanted. Dumbledore would later wonder whether she had simply given up, whether a witch of Merope's abilities could have chosen to survive if she had wanted to badly enough, whether, in the end, she had allowed herself to go. In the next chapter, we enter the dark corridors of Wool's Orphanage, where young Tom Riddle begins to discover what he is, and where the first terrible shape of what he will become starts to emerge from the shadows of his childhood. You won't want to miss how the boy born in a London orphanage on New Year's Eve becomes, in the space of a single decade, one of the most feared children in the wizarding world's history. Tom Riddle grew up at Wool's Orphanage in London during the 1930s, which is to say, he grew up in a grey institutional building during the grey years of an economic depression, in a world that was at that moment also producing, in its own muggle sphere, the political philosophies of racial supremacy and totalitarian power that would erupt into the Second World War. There is something to be said about the historical coincidence of Tom Riddle's childhood and the rise of fascism in Europe. It is not accidental that the two great conflicts of the 20th century, the Muggle World War that was fought largely in parallel with Grindelwald's terror campaign, and the two wizarding wars that followed, emerged from the same cultural moment, the same anxiety about blood and nation and identity, the same fear of contamination, and the same lust for purity. Tom Riddle did not know about the politics of the Muggle world around him. He was a child in an orphanage, but he was breathing the same air. Picture Wool's Orphanage as it was in the 1930s. Long corridors that smell of cabbage and disinfectant, rows of narrow iron beds, the particular grey of institutional curtains against windows that look out on London streets. The children who lived there were, as orphans in that era often were, the products of poverty and tragedy and wartime loss. Ordinary children who had lost their parents and found themselves in a system that fed and clothed them adequately, but loved them not at all. Tom Riddle was not an ordinary child. This was apparent from very early on, apparent first to the other children, who feared him in the unclear way that children fear something they cannot name, and then to the staff, who noted in their records that he was intelligent, serious, self-contained, and strange. He was a handsome boy, dark-haired and pale-skinned, with those very dark eyes that would later become famous as one of the few human features that survived his transformations into the Dark Lord, though by then the humanity in them had long since departed. He was quiet in the way that very controlled people are quiet, not passive but watchful, and he had already discovered before the age of 10 that he could make things happen with his mind, things that other people couldn't do. He could move objects without touching them. He could make animals come to him. He could hurt people or frighten them when he chose to. He had a snake, a boa constrictor of some kind, that he kept in a way that suggested he could communicate with it, which was not so far from the truth. He had already begun to weaponize his abilities, had already understood with the cold strategic clarity that would define him, that these powers could be used to establish dominance, to punish enemies and reward compliance, to make the world of the orphanage into something he could control. He was not a bully in the ordinary sense. He was something more deliberate than that. He was a child already practicing power. Mrs. Cole, the woman who ran Wool's orphanage when Albus Dumbledore came to visit in the summer of 1937, described Tom Riddle with a mixture of discomfort and something almost like awe. She told Dumbledore about 2 incidents in particular that had left lasting marks on the children involved. A boy named Billy Stubbs had been found hanging from the rafters after he had stolen Tom's rabbit. Not the boy, to be clear, but the rabbit strung up as a warning by no hand that anyone had seen. And a girl named Amy Benson and a boy named Dennis Bishop had been taken into a cave on the seashore during a summer trip, and had come out of that cave changed, silent and white-faced and unwilling ever to say what had happened inside. No one had ever managed to extract the full story from either of them. Tom, when questioned, had said he didn't know what they were talking about. And in the memory Dumbledore shared with Harry Potter decades later, the young professor who entered the orphanage in 1937 to tell Tom Riddle he was a wizard found a boy who was already in many ways beyond saving, not because goodness had been removed from him, but because something had already grown in its place that would take root in the vacancy left by lovelessness and grow into something that would eventually block out the light entirely. But in that meeting, in that grey room in Wool's orphanage, there was still something that was almost a child. Dumbledore's memory of the young Tom Riddle shows a boy who was clearly shaken, for perhaps the first time, by something he could not control. Because Dumbledore told him things he had never been told, that the strange abilities he had were real, that they had a name, that there was a whole world built around them, that he, Tom Riddle, was a wizard and had a place in that world. And for a moment in that memory, you can see on the boy's face something that looks almost like relief, something that might have been in a different child raised under different circumstances, the beginning of belonging. And then you watch it harden. You watch the calculation replace the relief. You watch him begin, immediately, to think about what this information means for him strategically, what kind of power it implies, what kind of world he is about to enter. He asked Dumbledore immediately whether he could speak to snakes, whether it was rare, whether it was special. He was already thinking about hierarchy, about where he would stand in this new world, whether he would be at the top or somewhere beneath others, and how to change that if necessary. Coming up next, Chapter 3, The Boy Who Made Darkness. His home, where you'll uncover how Tom Riddle arrived at Hogwarts and began the long, systematic project of becoming Lord Voldemort. What's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between potential and choice. There is a particular quality to the autumn morning when a child first sees Hogwarts. That moment of rounding a curve in the lake path and having the castle resolve itself out of the darkness and the mist. All those towers and battlements lit from within. the black water of the lake reflecting every window like a second castle built beneath the world. Imagine experiencing that for the first time as Tom Riddle experienced it, without anyone standing beside you who loved you, without any family member's hand to reach for, without the accumulation of bedtime stories about the school that other children had been told their whole lives. He arrived at that site with nothing behind him but an orphanage and a growing conviction that the world owed him recognition, and in front of him, suddenly, was this. And if you were Tom Riddle, what you would have felt looking at Hogwarts for the first time was not wonder, though you might have felt the raw material of wonder before it was quickly converted into something else. What you would have felt is, this is mine, not in the innocent sense that all children feel on first arriving somewhere that feels like home, in the sense of possession, in the sense of a hand closing around something it has always wanted without knowing it was looking for it. Tom Riddle was sorted into Slytherin House in the autumn of 1938, and the sorting hat, according to the way Dumbledore later described it, had barely touched his head before making its decision. Slytherin's qualities, ambition and cunning, and a certain disregard for the rules, were so deeply embedded in Tom Riddle's character that the hat did not need a moment's deliberation. He was already, at 11 years old, exactly what Slytherin was designed to produce. He walked to the Slytherin table and sat down and began immediately to observe, to catalogue, to understand the social architecture of the place he had just entered. Who were the important people? Who had power and what kind? What were the rules and which of them could be bent? Who would be useful? He did not approach these questions with childish curiosity. He approached them the way a general approaches unfamiliar terrain, looking for high ground. What Tom Riddle discovered at Hogwarts over those first months and years was that he was exceptional. This was not his imagination. He was genuinely, objectively exceptional, in a way that even the most accomplished witches and wizards who taught him could not help but acknowledge. His magical ability was staggering. His aptitude for complex spell work, for theory, for transfiguration and potions, and later for the dark arts, was so far beyond what was expected of students at his level that teachers competed quietly with each other over who could claim the most credit for his development. Professor Slughorn, who ran the exclusive and socially stratifying Slug Club for especially talented or well-connected students, saw in Tom Riddle the single most impressive pupil he had encountered in his entire career, and brought him into the Slug Club almost immediately, feeding him connections and praise, and the kind of social access that Riddle had never had before. Riddle accepted all of this with a graciousness and a charm that Slughorn and the other teachers found completely convincing. He had learned in the orphanage how to be whatever adults needed him to be when it served him. He deployed that skill at Hogwarts with the precision of a master craftsman. But underneath the charm, underneath the excellent marks and the prefect badge and the easy smile in the Slug Club, something else was happening. Something that Tom Riddle kept hidden from everyone except the small circle of followers he had begun to collect around himself. He was searching. He had come to Hogwarts not simply to learn magic, but to find something specific, something that had been growing as a need inside him since that moment in the orphanage when Dumbledore had told him there was a whole world he belonged to. He was searching for his history. He was searching for his family, for the source of the power that ran through him, for evidence of where he stood in the hierarchy of the wizarding world. And what he found as he dug through the records and the histories and the genealogical texts in the Hogwarts library changed everything. He found Slytherin. He found the connection, traced it back through the Gaunt family, through their long, terrible decline, through the generations of intermarriage, all the way back to the founder himself. He was the heir of Slytherin. He was not an orphan of no account, not a nobody from a Muggle orphanage who happened to have magical ability. He was the last living descendant of one of the most powerful wizards in the history of magic. And this was not merely a matter of pride to Tom Riddle. It was a revelation that restructured everything, that answered the question he had been asking in various forms his whole life, which was, who am I, and why am I so different? The answer, as he understood it, was, because I am greater than other people, because I have always been greater, because my blood is the proof. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. It was in his 5th year at Hogwarts, around 1942 or 43, that Tom Riddle found the answer to another question, one that had been pressing at him from an even deeper place than the question of his heritage. He had begun to think about death, not in the way that adolescents think about death, with the morbid, exploratory anxiety of a mind encountering its own finitude for the first time. He had begun to think about death as a problem to be solved. He had decided, with the same clinical certainty he brought to all his decisions, that he did not intend to die, that death was not something he was willing to accept as a given. And in pursuing this question through the darkest corners of the Hogwarts library, through the restricted section, and through texts that were not even technically permitted within the castle walls, he found something that had not been intended for him, something that the librarians and the teachers and even the headmaster had conspired in their way to keep from anyone. He found the concept of the Horcrux, which we will discuss in its full terrible detail later, is an object in which a wizard or witch hides a fragment of their soul, the soul being first split through an act of murder, the ultimate violation of natural law. By distributing pieces of one's soul among multiple objects, one becomes, in theory, immortal, because you cannot fully die as long as one piece of your soul remains tethered to the living world. It was an ancient, dark magic, known to Herpo the Foul in ancient Greece, and it had been barely practiced in the centuries since because it required not merely the killing of another person, but the willingness to bear the consequences of that killing, which included the tearing and disfiguring of one's own soul, in ways that the texts described in terms so dire that even hardened researchers in the dark arts had shied away. Tom Riddle did not shy away. He went instead to Professor Slughorn. He found a moment when the professor was alone and vulnerable and fond of him, which was not difficult to arrange, and he asked, in his charming and apparently innocent way, about Horcruxes. And Slughorn swept up in the warmth of his own fondness for this brilliant boy and his own desire to demonstrate his knowledge, told him. Not everything, not the full instructions, but enough. He told Riddle that a horcrux was an object in which one could hide a piece of the soul. He told him that it could be done by committing murder. And then, seeing the look in Riddle's eyes, he caught himself and changed the subject and carried the memory of that conversation as a private shame for the rest of his life. Because he had given the most dangerous student in Hogwarts history the piece of information that would allow him to begin his transformation into something that was no longer entirely human. Tom Riddle had already committed murder before he asked that question, as we shall soon see. And now he had a name for what he planned to do with that murder, and a framework and a purpose. The hunt for immortality had begun. Stick around for Chapter 4, The Chamber and the First Murder, where we uncover the events of 1942 and 43, the opening of the Chamber of Secrets, and the first steps toward the creation of something that should not exist. What happens in the dungeons of Hogwarts that year will alter the course of the entire wizarding world. We often think of the Chamber of Secrets as the story of Harry Potter's second year at Hogwarts, the frightening mystery of a 50-year-old terror returning. But the true story of the Chamber's original opening is something older and darker and centered entirely on a 16-year-old Tom Riddle, who had, by the winter of 1942, completed his decision to pursue immortality at any cost. Picture the dungeons of Hogwarts in the small hours of a winter morning, the torches burning low in their brackets on the walls, the corridors empty, the castle breathing around its walls with the deep, slow respiration of a structure that has stood for 1,000 years. Somewhere in the girls' bathroom on the second floor, beneath a tap engraved with a small serpent, there is an entrance, a pipe wide enough for a person to fit into, that leads down through the plumbing of the castle and deep into the foundations, into a tunnel carved from raw stone that leads eventually to a chamber so old and so carefully hidden that no one in living memory had found it. It had been built by Salazar Slytherin himself before his departure from Hogwarts, and it housed, coiled in the darkness at the far end of a long stone passage lined with carved serpent pillars, a basilisk of enormous size, perhaps the largest and oldest in existence, a creature that killed with a look that Slytherin had left as a weapon to be claimed by his heir when the heir arrived to continue the work of purging the school of those Slytherin had considered unworthy of magical education. The Muggle-born, the unclean, the contamination in the blood. Tom Riddle was the heir of Slytherin. He could speak parcel tongue, the serpent tongue that was Slytherin's gift and his mark, and he had found the entrance to the chamber and opened it and stood before that ancient basilisk, not with fear, but with something that looked from the outside like communion, like recognition between kindred things. He had learned to control it, or at least to direct it, and he had used it over the months that followed to terrorize the school, to petrify students who moved through the wrong corridors at the wrong hours, to cast a shadow over Hogwarts that no one could explain or trace back to its source. The attacks went on throughout the year, Muggle-born students primarily in the line of fire, petrified by the basilisk's gaze reflected in mirrors, or water, or glasses, or the flat surface of a camera lens. never directly, which would have meant death, because Riddle was not ready for death. Not of that kind, not with the entire school locked down and the investigation too hot. But then something went wrong. On the night that the basilisk killed a student named Moaning Myrtle in the girls' bathroom on the second floor, something shifted. Whether the basilisk had acted without direct instruction, or whether Riddle had miscalculated, the death of a student was a catastrophe that threatened everything. The school was on the verge of being closed. An innocent boy, a half-giant student named Rubius Hagrid, who had been keeping an acromantula in a box in his dormitory as a pet, fell under suspicion largely because Riddle framed him there deliberately and was expelled. The chamber was sealed, the attack stopped, and Tom Riddle had his murder. Myrtle's death, the first death he caused directly, was the murder that allowed him to create his first Horcrux. He took the small black diary, a nondescript school diary, and he poured a piece of his soul into it, anchoring that fragment of himself to an object that could survive the destruction of his body. He was 16 years old. He had killed a girl and hidden a piece of his soul in a book and framed an innocent student for it, and he would later win an award for special services to the school for bringing the matter to the authorities, because the version of events he reported cast him as the hero who had discovered Hagrid's guilt. He kept the award, a large engraved shield, in his room. Whether he ever looked at it with irony or pride, no one can say. In the next chapter, The Departure and the Deep Dive, you'll discover what Tom Riddle did after Hogwarts, how he refused a job at the Ministry of Magic and instead disappeared for a decade into the darkest corners of the magical world, and what he was doing during those missing years that no one could account for. You won't want to miss how a Hogwarts prefect becomes a ghost. Tom Riddle left Hogwarts in the summer of 1945 with the best academic record the school had seen in generations, with a set of awards and commendations that would have opened nearly any door in the wizarding world to him, and with a set of plans that had nothing to do with any of the doors the wizarding world traditionally offered. He had been invited to sit for what would be a perfect examination record. He had been offered positions in the Ministry of Magic, in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, which was considered a prestigious and fast-track route to power for talented young wizards. Professor Dumbledore, who was teaching Transfiguration at Hogwarts, and who had been watching Tom Riddle with a wary, deeply uncomfortable attention since their first meeting in the orphanage, wrote a warm reference for him because there was nothing he could prove, nothing he could point to, nothing beyond his own deep instinct that this boy, this brilliant and charming and impeccably behaved boy, was the most dangerous student he had ever taught. Riddle declined the ministry offer. He accepted instead a position at Borgin and Burke's, the disreputable shop in Knockturn Alley that dealt in dark and dangerous magical artifacts. The choice puzzled everyone who heard of it. It seemed beneath him. It seemed odd. And that was, of course, entirely the point. Borgin and Burke's gave Tom Riddle access to the kinds of objects and the kinds of knowledge that the Ministry of Magic would never have allowed him near. And it gave him a cover for travel, for approaching the old families who had things they wanted to sell, for moving through the less reputable parts of the wizarding world without attracting attention. Picture Tom Riddle in the years from 1945 to around 1955, which is our best reconstruction of when he disappeared entirely from the wizarding world's record. He is 20, then 25, then 30. He is handsome in a way that is beginning to have an edge to it, something not quite warm enough beneath the surface, dark eyes that assess rather than see. He is moving through the world of the dark artifacts trade with the easy charm he has always had, visiting the homes of old pure-blood families, cataloguing, collecting, calculating. And he is pursuing, beneath all of it, the project that drives everything, the creation of a network of horcruxes so extensive that he becomes, in effect, unkillable. He has one already, the diary. He needs more. And he has a specific vision for how many, a vision informed by his obsession with significant numbers and with the symbolism of magical tradition. He intends to create 7 horcruxes total, because 7 is the most powerfully magical number, the number of completion and perfection. This would mean 6 objects each containing a fragment of soul, with the 7th fragment remaining in his own body. But to create each one, he must commit murder. And murder, each successive one, tears further at the soul, fragments it further, dims the humanity that remains. He is building his immortality piece by piece and paying for it with pieces of himself. There are certain landmarks in this period that we can identify with confidence. The visit to the Gaunt family cottage in Little Hangleton, which we know took place at some point in this period, because Riddle went to find his Muggle father, whom he had never met, and to take the Gaunt ring, which he recognized as an heirloom of Slytherin's family, and which he intended to make into his second Horcrux. He found his Muggle grandfather, Marvolo Gaunt, dead in the cottage, apparently long since, and his uncle Morfin Gaunt still living there, unkempt and half-mad, and apparently unaware of anything beyond his own bitterness. Riddle stole into his uncle's mind with the legilimency he had spent years perfecting, and extracted the memories he needed. Memories of what Morfin knew of the Riddle family down the hill, of the 3 Riddles who lived in the large house, Tom Riddle Sr. and his parents. And then Tom Riddle walked down the hill to the Riddle House, wand in hand, and murdered all 3 of them. He murdered his own father, the man who had abandoned his mother, the man whose name he bore and whom he had never met. He murdered Tom Riddle Sr.'s elderly parents, his own grandparents, as collateral. He left their bodies in the parlour where they had been found without marks, apparently healthy, apparently dead of inexplicable fright, which is what the Muggle coroner's report would later conclude. And he framed his uncle Morfin for the murders, modifying his memory so that Morfin believed he had done it himself, and left the Gaunt ring as evidence on his uncle's finger when the Auras arrived. Morfin Gaunt went to Azkaban for the triple murder of the Riddle family and died there. He was the last of the Gaunts, and with his death, the line of Slytherin in its oldest form ended, replaced entirely by its secret inheritor, who had by this point abandoned the name Riddle entirely, and was no longer using it even in private. He had chosen a new name for himself in those years, a name that he had constructed as an anagram of his full given name, Tom Marvolo Riddle, a name that declared what he was and what he intended, and that erased every trace of the orphan boy who had shivered in a grey London building and dreamed of something more. He had become Lord Voldemort. Coming up next, Chapter 6, The Making of the Dark Lord, where we trace the years in which Voldemort gathered his first followers, refined his ideology, and began the transformation of his physical form that would eventually render him barely recognizable as human. What happens in the years between 1955 and the establishment of the Death Eaters will challenge everything you thought you knew about how evil organizes itself. We often think of the Death Eaters as they appear in the events of 1979 to 1981. The robed and masked figures, the green flash of the killing curse, the dark mark burning in the sky over houses where they had visited. But the Death Eaters did not emerge fully formed from nothing. They were assembled over a period of at least a decade from an existing structure that Voldemort had been building since his Hogwarts years. In school, he had gathered around him a group of students, younger and more impressionable than himself, who were drawn by his charisma and his evident power, and by the ideology he offered them, an ideology that confirmed everything they had been raised to believe about blood purity and the superiority of the magical over the non-magical. He called this group his Knights of Walpurgis initially, a grandiose and theatrical name that would later be replaced by the starker and more brutal designation that history knows them by, the Death Eaters, his followers who bore his mark, literally, in the form of the dark mark burned into their left forearms, a skull with a serpent tongue that was a declaration of allegiance from which there was no withdrawing. Picture the world into which Voldemort began his open campaign of terror, and understand something about the context that made it possible. The wizarding world of 1950s and 60s. Britain was a world still recovering from the aftermath of Grindelwald's War. The Dark Wizard, who had nearly succeeded in establishing a pure-blood supremacist empire across Europe, before being defeated by Albus Dumbledore in the legendary duel of 1945. The shock of that war had left the wizarding world shaken, but had also, paradoxically, created a kind of vulnerability. People wanted to believe it was over, that the lesson had been learned, that such a thing could not happen again. The Ministry of Magic, under various ministers in the 1950s and 60s, had spent much of its energy on international healing, on rebuilding the relationships damaged by Grindelwald's campaign, on establishing the new protocols of the Statute of Secrecy that kept the magical world hidden from Muggle notice. The internal life of magical Britain, the persistent tensions around blood status, the resentment of Muggle-born witches and wizards who were quietly and persistently discriminated against in ways that the ministry officially denied, the poverty and marginalization of half-bloods and squibs, and those who married outside the pure-blood families. These things continued underneath the surface of official optimism. And into that tension, Voldemort's ideology arrived like a match struck in a room full of gas. His ideology was not entirely original. It owed everything to Slytherin's ancient framework, to Grindelwald's rhetoric, to the blood supremacist traditions of the old pure-blood families, like the Blacks and the Notts and the Malfoys. But Voldemort's version was different in one crucial respect, and that difference made it more efficient and more dangerous than any of its predecessors. He genuinely did not care about pure blood for its own sake. He cared about power. Blood purity was, to him, an organizational principle rather than a genuine belief, a useful way of sorting people into hierarchies, of identifying potential allies and rewarding loyalty, of creating a sense of in-group membership that bound people to him more tightly than abstract ideology ever could. He himself was a half-blood, the son of a Muggle father, and he was perfectly aware of this and regarded it without any apparent internal conflict. What he cared about was the demonstration of magical supremacy, his own above all others, and the construction of a world in which he stood at the top of an order that acknowledged his power and answered to it. The blood rhetoric was the vehicle. He was the destination. His first major recruitment drive drew on the old pureblood families who had always resented the ministry's moderate policies, who had chafed against the statute of secrecy and the restrictions on the use of magic, who had lost political ground over the previous century as the ministry moved towards something marginally resembling representation of all magical people. He approached them carefully, one family at a time, assessing who could be won by flattery and who by fear and who by the simple offer of power. He built a network that by the mid-1960s was already substantial and well organized, with layers of command and information that protected him and kept different groups of followers ignorant of each other's identities and activities. He was a natural organizer, a natural political mind, and the network he built had a sophistication that would later frustrate and bewilder the auras assigned to dismantle it. You could not arrest Lord Voldemort's organization by arresting any individual member, because no individual member knew enough to destroy the whole. But Voldemort was also, during this same period, pursuing something else entirely, something that ran parallel to the political organization and the recruitment and the ideology, something that was much more private and much more disturbing. He was continuing the project of the Horcruxes. He was committing murders and distributing pieces of his soul among a carefully chosen collection of objects. Objects chosen for their significance to him specifically, for their history and their power and their resonance. The diary was already made. The ring was made from the gaunt ring, made during the murders at Little Hangleton. Now he needed more. And as he went about this project, murder by murder, soul fragment by soul fragment, his physical appearance began to change in ways that his followers noticed but were too afraid to comment on. His face, which had been handsome in his school years, was becoming something else. The skin was growing paler, the features sharper, the eyes beginning to redden at the edges, and then deeper, the nose beginning to flatten, the nostrils slitting in the manner of a serpent, the body growing thinner, less solid, as if the human matter of him was being consumed by the magic that sustained the increasingly distributed soul. He was becoming the figure that history would know, chalk-white and red-eyed and flat-nosed, a face that people who encountered it could not look at directly, not because of any enchantment, but because of what it communicated at a level below conscious thought. That whatever this was, it was not fully a person anymore. In the next chapter, the Dark Lord revealed, you'll discover how Voldemort moved from covert organization to open terror campaign, and what the wizarding world experienced in the years leading up to the First Wizarding War. You won't want to miss the full scope of the darkness that descended on magical Britain in the 1970s. The transition from the 1960s, when Voldemort's activities were largely covert, to the 1970s, when they became impossible to ignore, did not happen all at once. It happened the way a storm gathers, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed and violence, until you cannot remember what the calm felt like. Picture magical Britain in the early 1970s. There is still a surface of normal life. The Quidditch matches, the Hogsmeade weekends, the ministry balls, the owls carrying ordinary post between ordinary wizarding homes. Diagon Alley is still busy. Children are still being sent to Hogwarts. The ordinary rhythms of magical life continue. But there is something underneath it now, a low current of anxiety, of whispered conversation at the back of shops that stops when someone unknown enters, of disappearances reported in the Daily Prophet that are buried deep in the paper and described with careful vagueness. The death of a Muggle here, the burning of a Muggle-born family's home there, a ministry official found dead in circumstances that suggest magical involvement, but that are officially attributed to other causes. Voldemort's campaign had not yet become the open, howling terror it would be by the late 70s. It was still wearing a disguise, but the disguise was beginning to slip. The Death Eaters had by this point moved beyond recruitment and were actively engaged in acts of violence and intimidation against both the Muggle and Wizarding populations. Their targets included Muggle-born witches and wizards who had achieved positions of prominence in the ministry, Muggle families connected to magical families by accident of birth or marriage, anyone who spoke publicly against Voldemort's agenda or who was understood to be organizing resistance. The Dark Mark, the great skull with the serpent tongue, cast in green fire into the sky above the site of an attack, became the most feared symbol in the wizarding world. When people saw it appear over a house, they knew what they would find inside. The ministry response to this was, in those early years, inadequate. Not because the auras were incompetent, though some of them were, but because the network they were fighting was better organized and more ruthless than anything the wizarding world's law enforcement had been designed to deal with. The rules that governed aura conduct, the restrictions on the use of unforgivable curses, the requirement for evidence before arrest, the protections built into wizarding law against wrongful imprisonment. All of these things were constraints that Voldemort's followers felt no obligation to observe. The Death Eaters could use the killing curse freely. The auras could not. It was a fundamental asymmetry. What changed in the mid to late 1970s was the escalation to open campaign. By 1978 and into 1979, the attacks were no longer occasional and deniable. They were frequent and public and claimed openly. The Dark Mark appeared in the skies over multiple sites per week. Pure-blood families who refused to pledge allegiance to Voldemort found themselves terrorized into compliance or dead. The Ministry of Magic, under the increasingly desperate Minister Millicent Bagnold, authorized the auras to use unforgivable curses, to kill if necessary, and to imprison without trial in the most extreme cases. A decision that created its own set of horrors, as we shall see. Albus Dumbledore, who had watched the rise of Voldemort with mounting dread for 20 years, established a secret organization called the Order of the Phoenix to resist him, gathering a group of witches and wizards who were willing to fight outside the official structures of the ministry, who were more mobile and more flexible, and who understood the enemy in ways that the ministry's bureaucracy did not. The order was small but extraordinarily capable, comprising some of the best fighters of the era: Alastair Moody, Elphias Doge, Daedalus Diggle, Sturgis Podmore, the McKinnons, the Prewets, Lily, and James Potter. These were people who had chosen to stand between the wizarding world and the darkness that was closing around it, knowing the cost, some of them, of what that choice might mean. In the next chapter, The Prophecy and the Potters, you'll discover the precise chain of events that led to the night of October, the 31st, 1981, and to the most important failed murder in the history of magic. Stick around, because what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew about destiny and choice. There is perhaps no moment in the entire history of the wizarding world more heavily weighted with consequence than the evening in the spring of 1980, when a young witch named Sybil Trelawney sat down in a private room above the Hogshead pub in Hogsmeade, across from Albus Dumbledore, who was interviewing her for the position of divination teacher at Hogwarts. Sybil Trelawney, in the ordinary course of things, was not a particularly gifted seer. She was the great-great-granddaughter of a genuinely powerful prophetess named Cassandra Trelawney, and had inherited from this ancestry a certain susceptibility to the real seer's trance. But her day-to-day predictions and tea-leaf readings were largely nonsense dressed up in theatrical presentation. But on this evening, in the middle of her interview with Dumbledore, something happened that was not theatrical presentation at all. Something genuine. Her eyes glazed over, her voice dropped into a harsh, impersonal register, and she spoke a prophecy that Dumbledore recognized immediately as the real thing. She said that the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, that he will be born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and that the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but that he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and that neither can live while the other survives. Dumbledore sat very still for a long moment after the prophecy ended, and Trelawney returned to herself with no memory of having spoken. He recognized the gravity of what he had heard. He took steps immediately to ensure that the prophecy would be preserved safely in the Department of Mysteries, where all genuine prophecies were recorded, to ensure that it remained secret, known only to himself. But he was not the only one listening. Outside the door of that private room, because the pub's owner had rented the space under the private staircase to a man who turned out to be a spy, crouched a young Death Eater who had pressed his ear to the keyhole and heard a portion of what was said. He heard the beginning. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. He heard that much. He did not hear the rest. He did not hear the part about the power the Dark Lord knows not. He did not hear the part that said, neither can live while the other survives. He heard a fragment, and he carried that fragment directly to Lord Voldemort. The spy was Severus Snape, a young man we will return to at length when we discuss the full complexity of his role in this story. At this point, he was a Death Eater, young and brilliant and deeply compromised, and he had not yet understood what the fragment of prophecy he had delivered would cost. Voldemort, receiving the partial prophecy, made an interpretation. The prophecy spoke of someone who would be born at the end of July, to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times. At the time this was spoken, there were 2 candidates who fit, the infant sons of 2 Order of the Phoenix families. The first was Neville Longbottom, son of Frank and Alice Longbottom, both highly accomplished Aurors. The second was the as yet unborn child of Lily and James Potter, due in late July. Voldemort chose Harry Potter. The reason he chose Harry rather than Neville is something Dumbledore spent considerable time analysing. He concluded that Voldemort chose Harry because Harry was, like Voldemort himself, a half-blood. A pure-blood opponent would have been less personally resonant to a man who had been told all his life that blood determined destiny. A half-blood who could threaten him was a more meaningful opponent, and in choosing Harry Potter as the one marked by the prophecy, Voldemort created the very threat the prophecy described. Picture the months that followed the prophecy in the summer and autumn of 1980. James and Lily Potter, warned by Dumbledore that they were specifically targeted, went into hiding with their infant son. Dumbledore arranged for them to use the Fidelius charm, the most powerful secrecy enchantment known to wizarding lore, which would conceal the location of a person or place within the mind of a single secret keeper, rendering it completely undetectable by any means, unless the secret keeper chose to reveal it. The person chosen to be secret keeper was James Potter's best friend, Sirius Black, who seemed the obvious choice, brave and clever and utterly devoted to James. But Sirius himself suggested a change of plan. He suggested that the Potters use Peter Pettigrew instead, a quieter, less obvious choice, someone Voldemort would never suspect. It seemed, at the time, like a good idea. It was the worst decision any of them ever made. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. Peter Pettigrew was a Death Eater. He had been one for some time, turned by fear, by the grinding pressure of being associated with people who were braver and more talented than himself, by Voldemort's particular ability to find the places in a person where self-regard had curdled into resentment and pour something into that space. He had been feeding information to Voldemort for years, betraying Order members one by one. And now, as secret keeper for the Potters, he had everything Voldemort needed. He gave up the Potters' location within a week. On the night of October the 31st, 1981, Lord Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow. Picture Godric's Hollow on that evening. It is Halloween. The streets of the village are quiet, the night cold and clear, leaves blowing across the lane in the October wind. In a small cottage near the edge of the village, James and Lily Potter are at home with their son, Harry, who is 15 months old. James Potter was the first to face Voldemort that night. He did not have his wand on him when Voldemort entered the cottage. He had left it in another room. He told Lily to take Harry and go to get out, and he tried to hold the door alone without magic against Lord Voldemort. He died for it. He died in the entrance hall of the cottage, alone and without a wand, trying to buy his wife and son 30 more seconds. Lily ran upstairs with Harry. She could have escaped through the window. She could have disapparated, but the Fidelius charm had been broken, and she knew there was nowhere to go that Voldemort could not follow. She put Harry in his cot, and she turned, and she faced Voldemort when he entered the room, and she did not move. He told her to stand aside. She refused. He told her she did not need to die that night. She said she would not move, and he killed her. Here is something that no one fully understood for many years, something that Dumbledore eventually pieced together from the evidence. Lily Potter's death was the activation of the most ancient magical protection in existence. When a person sacrifices themselves willingly for another, when they choose death for love with no coercion, they create a magical protection in the blood of the one they die for that reflects certain kinds of magic directly, renders it literally incapable of taking hold in that person's body. Lily's sacrifice for Harry created this protection in her son. When Voldemort pointed his wand at the infant Harry and spoke the killing curse, the most powerful and unblockable spell in all of magic, the spell could not touch him. The love magic that ran through Harry's blood, conferred by his mother's sacrifice, reflected the curse entirely. It bounced back and struck Lord Voldemort himself, and in the absence of a body that was capable of receiving it. Because Voldemort's fragmented soul could not simply die the way a complete soul dies, the curse tore him apart. It stripped him of his physical form, left him in a barely existent state of wraithhood, less than a ghost, barely a presence, a wisp of something that had been a person and was no longer entirely anything. He fled Godric's Hollow. Harry Potter survived, and on his forehead there was a scar in the shape of a lightning bolt. And in that scar, something lived that would not be understood for 16 more years. The tiny fragment of Lord Voldemort's soul that had been in his body at the moment the curse rebounded had nowhere to go. The other Horcruxes still existed, which is why he did not die entirely. But the fragment that had been in him was displaced, and it attached itself, with the blind hunger of a thing that cannot bear non-existence, to the only living thing in the room, Harry Potter. Harry Potter became an accidental Horcrux. He became a container for a piece of Voldemort's soul without anyone intending it, including Voldemort himself. This was the secret that would determine the shape of the entire story from that night forward. The secret that would eventually demand the most from Harry Potter. The sacrifice that the true conclusion of the story would require. But that is still years away. For now, there is only a cottage with 2 dead adults and a crying baby with a lightning scar on his forehead. And outside the cottage, the night is very quiet and the street is very empty. And something that was once Lord Voldemort is drifting through the darkness toward what comes next. In the next chapter, The Long Darkness, you'll discover what Voldemort's near destruction meant for the wizarding world, for the Death Eaters who were left behind, and for the scattered fragments of a soul in search of a way back to existence. You won't want to miss the full story of the years between the fall and the return. The morning after Voldemort's fall brought to the wizarding world something it had not experienced in so long that many people alive had never known it. The sensation of safety. Imagine the wizarding world on the 1st of November. 1981. The news travelled faster than any owl, through the magical rumour networks that witches and wizards maintained in the way that all close communities maintain informal channels of mass communication. Something had happened at Godric's Hollow. Something had happened to you-know-who. The celebrations were immediate and overwhelming, a spontaneous outpouring of joy and relief that the Muggle world briefly noticed in the form of unexplained fireworks and an unusual proliferation of owls flying in daylight. The Minister for Magic herself, Millicent Bagnold, later told the Wizengamot that she had spent the day trying to maintain the statute of secrecy in the face of a wizarding population that simply could not contain itself. People were hugging each other in the streets of Hogsmeade. Witches and wizards were toasting the name of Harry Potter in every pub, from the Leaky Cauldron to the Three Broomsticks. Some people, Hagrid among them, wept openly. The weight that had pressed down on the wizarding world for a decade and a half had lifted in a night, and the lightness of that morning felt almost physically different, like breathing air that had not been stale with fear. But beneath the celebrations, there were darker currents, and they would surface quickly. The Death Eaters, the core of Voldemort's organization, responded to the news of their master's fall in different ways. Some of them, those who had been followers out of genuine ideological commitment rather than fear, simply refused to believe it. Bellatrix Lestrange, the most fanatical of Voldemort's inner circle, and her husband Rodolphus and brother-in-law Rabastan, along with a fourth Death Eater named Bartemius Crouch Jr., went out that very week and captured two Auras, Frank and Alice Longbottom, the parents of the other child who might have been the subject of the prophecy, and tortured them into insanity with the Cruciatus Curse in an attempt to extract information about Voldemort's whereabouts. They were caught and tried and sentenced to life imprisonment in Azkaban, and Bellatrix's defiant speech at her sentencing became one of the most chilling documents in wizarding legal history, a declaration that her master was not dead and would return, and that she would be waiting for him. Many others took a different approach entirely. They claimed, with varying degrees of plausibility, that they had been acting under the Imperious Curse, that they had had no choice, that they had been compelled by Voldemort's magic against their will. Some of these claims were true. The Imperious Curse had genuinely been used extensively by Voldemort to control Muggle and wizarding officials alike. But some of them were not true, and the Ministry, overwhelmed by the volume of cases and by the pressure to return to normal as quickly as possible, allowed many Death Eaters to walk free on the basis of claims that did not survive serious scrutiny. Lucius Malfoy, for example, returned to his family home at Malfoy Manor and resumed his seat on the Hogwarts Board of Governors and his position as a respected member of wizarding society. His generous donation to the Ministry coffers, helping to smooth the edges of an inquiry that had never been as rigorous as justice demanded. The official history recorded by the Ministry in the years that followed was essentially, Voldemort is gone, the war is over, normal life has resumed. It was convenient, this history. It allowed the people who had made bad choices under pressure to quietly reintegrate. It allowed the Ministry itself to avoid examining too closely its own failures of intelligence and response. It allowed everyone to draw a line under the worst period in living memory and agree collectively that it was over. What it did not do was actually heal the damage or address the structures that had allowed Voldemort to operate for so long, or acknowledge the people, mostly Muggle-born and half-blood witches and wizards, who had been killed or driven into exile during the Terror, whose deaths and losses were not being officially counted or commemorated, because to count them properly would be to admit how catastrophic the failure had been. The wizarding world did what traumatized communities often do. It looked away. Meanwhile, in the darkness, in the forests of Albania, something that had been Lord Voldemort persisted. Barely. He was less than a ghost, as he himself later described it, less than the meanest creature that lived. He had no body, no physical form, no way of directly interacting with the world, but he existed. The Horcruxes ensured that, as long as any piece of his soul was anchored to the living world, he could not die, not truly. He drifted through the forests, possessing small animals when he needed sensation, sustaining himself on the life force of creatures he could overwhelm with the sheer power of his presence. He was waiting. He did not know how long it would take or what opportunity would present itself. He only knew that he would return, that he had survived the unsurvivable because he had prepared for it, because he was Lord Voldemort, and Lord Voldemort had made himself unforgettable and unkillable, and that eventually the right vessel would come. It came years later in the form of a young professor of defense against the dark arts named Quirinus Quirrell, a man who had travelled to Albania as part of a journey into the dark arts that he had undertaken more for intellectual curiosity than genuine commitment to evil, and who encountered the wraith of Voldemort in the Albanian forest and found himself unable to resist the possession that followed. Quirrell returned to Britain with Voldemort living in the turban wrapped around his head, sharing his body with the Dark Lord's spirit in an arrangement that was draining Quirrell's life away, but that gave Voldemort eyes and hands and presence in the world again. He did not reveal himself immediately. He was not strong enough. He needed something, a means of returning to full physical form, and he had identified what that means was, the Philosopher's Stone. In the next chapter, The Stone and the First Return, you'll discover the full story of what happened during Harry Potter's first year at Hogwarts, the confrontation in the underground chamber, and what Voldemort's first attempt at restoration revealed about both combatants. You won't want to miss how a child of 11 becomes the first person in over a decade to face Lord Voldemort and survive. Harry Potter arrived at Hogwarts in the autumn of 1991, precisely a decade after the night in Godric's Hollow, and the world he arrived in was one that had spent that decade trying to pretend it was fine. The wizarding world had rebuilt its external structures with remarkable efficiency. The Quidditch World Cup season was going well. Diagon Alley was prosperous. Hogwarts had a full enrollment, but the psychological damage was still there, still visible in the way people reacted to Harry's name, in the tears that sprang unexpectedly to the eyes of strangers who glimpsed his lightning bolt scar, in the reflexive refusal of most witches and wizards to say Voldemort's name aloud, still calling him you-know-who, or he who must not be named, with the particular emphasis of people who believed, somewhere deep in their bodies, that speaking a name could summon what the name described. It was a community still afraid of what might come back, and what they feared was already in the castle. Quirrell's scheme to steal the Philosopher's Stone was subtle and patient, and very nearly successful. The stone, created by Nicola Flamel, was the one object in the world capable of producing the elixir of life, a potion that could restore a person to full physical life and health, regardless of what had been done to them. Voldemort needed it. Under his direction, Quirrell maneuvered around the extensive protections placed on the stone by Dumbledore and the other Hogwarts staff, and on the night that Harry, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger solved the final series of protections and reached the underground chamber where the Mirror of Erist held the stone. It was Harry and Quirrell who arrived together at the last moment, and it was Harry who retrieved the stone from the mirror, because he wanted to find it but not use it, and it was Quirrell who reached for it and could not take it from him, because Lily Potter's sacrifice protection remained in Harry's skin, and the touch of a creature hosting Voldemort's spirit meant agony and disintegration. Quirrell burned away from Harry's grip, or rather from the collision of Voldemort's presence with that living love, and Voldemort fled again, and Harry collapsed, and Dumbledore arrived, and the stone was destroyed to prevent its being used in any future attempt. In the aftermath of that confrontation, Harry Potter sat in the hospital wing and talked to Dumbledore about what it all meant, about why Quirrell had not been able to touch him, about why Voldemort had not simply taken the stone by force. And Dumbledore told him, calmly, and with only the hint of the deeper knowledge he was not yet ready to share, that love was the most powerful magic in the world, that it was something Voldemort did not understand and could not reproduce. It was the first time Harry heard this, but it would not be the last. The conversation that Dumbledore began in that hospital wing was the first thread of a teaching that would only be completed 6 years later, in a different kind of chamber, in the middle of a different kind of crisis. The full understanding was still far away. For now, there was just a boy with a lightning scar, not quite sure yet of what he was holding. Stick around for Chapter 10, The Diary and the Chamber, where we uncover the return of Voldemort's first Horcrux, and what it revealed about the nature of the darkness he had created. What happens in Harry's second year at Hogwarts opens a window into the full horror of what Voldemort planned. The second year of Harry Potter's time at Hogwarts, the autumn of 1992, was marked by the opening of the Chamber of Secrets for the second time. And it was marked by the reappearance of the most ancient and most personal of Voldemort's Horcruxes, the school diary that he had made 50 years earlier, the first fragment of his soul he had ever separated from himself. The record of Tom Riddle at 16, still in the flush of his early genius, before the full extent of what he would become had fully taken hold in his features. The diary had made its way through Lucius Malfoy's possession into the hands of Ginny Weasley, the youngest of the Weasley siblings, and it had begun slowly and patiently, and with the particular cunning of a fragment of Voldemort's soul that contained the full intelligence of the 16-year-old who had made it, to possess her. It drew her in through what appeared to be a sympathetic connection, a blank book that responded to her writing. that seemed to understand her loneliness and her anxieties about her first year at a school where everyone expected something of her because of her family, and it used her slowly, taking more of her control each time she wrote in it, until she was sleepwalking through the castle in the night hours, and writing on the walls in the blood of roosters, and opening the chamber of secrets, and setting the basilisk loose on the student population. Harry Potter, following the chain of clues left by the attacks, eventually found his way into the chamber itself, where Ginny lay collapsed on the floor and Tom Riddle stood above her, beautiful and dark and more substantial every minute as the life drained out of Ginny and the soul fragment fed on it. Tom Riddle explained himself to Harry in the chamber that night, with the patience of a teacher. He showed Harry the anagram, rearranged the letters of his name in the air. I am Lord Voldemort. He told him about his plans for immortality. He told him that Harry could not hope to defeat him. And Harry, armed with the sword of Gryffindor and accompanied by Fawkes the Phoenix and the old sorting hat, drove a basilisk fang into the diary and destroyed it, destroyed the fragment of soul within it, and drove the same basilisk fang through his own arm in the process, which would have killed him if Fawkes had not wept phoenix tears into the wound. He was 12 years old. He had just destroyed his first Horcrux without knowing what a Horcrux was. The aftermath of the Chamber of Secrets affair is significant beyond the immediate resolution, because it led directly to Lucius Malfoy's downfall as a Board of Governors member, and to his having to free Dobby the house elf from his service in an act that had been designed as revenge on Harry, but that was executed with such poor judgment that it became instead the act of liberation that removed the most loyal creature in the Malfoy household from their service. Small threads, small consequences. But in this story, as in all stories, the small consequences accumulate. In the next chapter, The Prisoner and the Prophecy's Fuller Shape, you'll discover what the events of Harry's third year revealed about the past and about the network of loyalties and betrayals that had shaped everything, leading up to Voldemort's fall. You won't want to miss the revelation of Peter Pettigrew's survival and what it meant for what came next. Harry Potter's third year at Hogwarts was the year that the past came back, literally and catastrophically, in the form of a prisoner who had spent 12 years in Azkaban for a crime he had not committed, and a rat who had spent 12 years hiding in the form of a rat rather than face the consequences of the crime he had committed. Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban in the summer of 1993, the first person ever to do so, and the wizarding world understood his escape as proof of his irredeemable evil, the necessary conclusion of a year-long campaign of terror. A madman escaped from the most secure prison in the world. The truth was entirely different, and discovering it required a full year of misdirection and confusion, and a final confrontation on the grounds of Hogwarts in the light of a full moon. We will not rehearse every detail of that year here, but the central revelation matters enormously for the larger story. Peter Pettigrew was alive. The supposed victim of Sirius Black's supposed massacre had faked his own death, cut off his own finger to leave evidence, transformed into a rat, and lived for 12 years as Ron Weasley's pet, hiding in plain sight. When he was cornered in the shrieking shack and the full truth came out, Harry Potter chose, at Sirius's urging, to let Peter live rather than kill him without trial, to take him back to the castle to face wizarding justice. It was a merciful choice. It was also, as Dumbledore told Harry with quiet force afterward, a choice that would matter more than Harry could possibly know, because saving a life creates a bond, a magical debt, a claim on the one saved by the one who saved them. The debt Pettigrew owed Harry Potter would not come due for 4 more years, but when it did, it would change the outcome of the story. The 3rd year also saw the arrival of Dementors as guards around Hogwarts, and Harry's first encounter with the full force of what Dementors did to him specifically. The Dementors' effect, which forces the most terrible memories to the surface and introduces the cold sensation of despair that these creatures generate in all their victims, was particularly severe for Harry, because the worst memories he had access to were not ordinary memories. They were the memory of his mother's voice on the night she died, the sound of her screaming, and then the sudden silence. Harry could hear this every time a Dementor came near him, could hear her begging for Harry's life in the last moments of hers. The Patronus charm that Professor Lupin taught him to repel the Dementors, and the memories they summoned, was another small thread in the larger tapestry. The shape of a silver stag, the same form as his father's animagus transformation, erupting from his wand to drive back the darkness. These things mattered. Even here, even in the work of surviving his own education, Harry Potter was being prepared for something. In the next chapter, The Goblet of Fire and the Return to Flesh, you'll discover the full story of Harry's 4th year at Hogwarts and the catastrophic event that ended it, the event that changed everything. Stick around, because the chapter that follows is the turning point of the entire story. The Tri-Wizard Tournament of 1994 to 95 was supposed to be a celebration, a restoration of an ancient tradition of magical competition between the 3 great schools of the European wizarding world, Hogwarts, Beauxbatons, and Durmstrang. It was supposed to be exciting and glamorous and a positive occasion, and for most of its duration, it was those things, if you exclude the element of genuine mortal danger built into the tournament's design, which most people managed to set aside in the excitement of the spectacle. But the tournament had been manipulated from the beginning by a plan so patient and so detailed that it had been in motion for a full year before anyone understood what it was. Bartemius Crouch Jr., who had escaped from Azkaban years before in the act of his mother's self-sacrifice for him, had been living under his father's care, under an imperious curse, had broken free of it, had stolen the identity of Aurora Laster Moody using Polyjuice Potion, and had spent a year inside Hogwarts executing a plot to ensure that Harry Potter won the tournament and reached the Tri-Wizard Cup, which had been transfigured into a portkey that would take the holder to a location in the countryside, to a graveyard, to a specific graveyard in Little Hangleton, the graveyard where Tom Riddle Sr. and his parents were buried. Picture that graveyard on the night of June 24th, 1995. Harry Potter grabs the cup alongside Cedric Diggory, a 4th-year champion from Hufflepuff, a decent and brave young man who had competed fairly and helped Harry throughout the tournament, with a generosity that demonstrated exactly the kind of wizard he was. They are transported instantly to the darkness and the cold of the Little Hangleton graveyard, and within seconds of their arrival, a figure wrapped in cloaks emerges from the darkness carrying a bundle, and a high, cold voice says, "Kill the spare," and Cedric Diggory is murdered where he stands. He does not die dramatically. He dies with a flash of green light and a moment's expression of surprise. And then he is simply gone, the body in the grass, and Harry Potter is alive and bound to a gravestone. And what is happening to him is only beginning. The graveyard sequence is one of the most thoroughly detailed accounts of a dark ritual in wizarding history, because Harry was conscious throughout and remembered every detail. The restoration of Voldemort's body required 3 ingredients: bone of the father unknowingly given, flesh of the servant willingly given, and blood of the enemy forcibly taken. The father's bone rose from the earth of the graveyard, from Tom Riddle Sr.'s grave. Peter Pettigrew cut off his own hand for the servant's flesh, and Pettigrew used a knife to cut Harry's arm and collect his blood. The cauldron boiled, and from it Lord Voldemort rose. He rose with a fully restored body, white-skinned and red-eyed and flat-nosed and barely human. And he stood in the graveyard and looked at his own hands and smiled. And it was the most terrifying thing Harry Potter had ever witnessed, because it was wrong the way a thing can be technically a human shape, and yet communicate in the most fundamental way that it is nothing of the kind. He was real again. He had a body. He had hands. He called his Death Eaters to him, summoning them through the dark marks on their arms, and they appeared one by one in the graveyard, those who had avoided Azkaban, and those who had served their time and been released, and they knelt to him in the darkness among the gravestones. It was the first time Harry saw the full inner circle assembled in one place. Lucius Malfoy, Crabbe, Goyle, Avery, McNair, Nott, Bellatrix's fellow survivors, figures who had been living apparently normal lives in the wizarding world for 14 years, while their master rebuilt himself in Albanian forests. They knelt, and Voldemort spoke. He spoke about what he had endured, about his return, about what he intended to do now. And in the long monologue of that speech, 2 things happened simultaneously. He demanded that Harry Potter duel him because he wanted to demonstrate his superiority personally and publicly to his followers, wanted to show that Harry Potter was no magical match for the most powerful dark wizard in history. And Harry Potter, through the priori incantatem phenomenon, when their wands connected, made contact with the shades of his murdered parents and Cedric Diggory, who gave him the few seconds he needed to break the connection and grab Cedric's body and activate the portkey and return to Hogwarts. He returned to Hogwarts clutching a dead boy, screaming that Voldemort was back. In the next chapter, The World Turns Away, you'll discover how the wizarding world responded to Harry's testimony of Voldemort's return, and how the denial and political cowardice of the Ministry of Magic in 1995 created the conditions for the catastrophe that followed. You won't want to miss the full story of how the wizarding establishment chose comfortable lies over dangerous truth. We often think of courage as the quality that the wizarding world was lacking in the years immediately following the return of Voldemort in 1995. And that is partly true, but it was not only courage. It was something more mundane and in some ways more depressing. It was institutional self-interest. The Ministry of Magic, under the new minister Cornelius Fudge, was unwilling to believe that Voldemort had returned, and unwilling in the specific way that people who have built their careers on a comfortable status quo are unwilling to acknowledge that the status quo has been destroyed. To admit that Voldemort was back meant admitting that the last 14 years of ministry complacency had been exactly that. Complacency. That the Death Eaters, who had walked free on dubious claims of Imperius, had been allowed to remain in positions of influence in wizarding society, that the systems the ministry had put in place to prevent Voldemort's return had failed entirely. These were not merely political admissions. They were catastrophic exposures of individual and institutional failure. And so, the ministry chose, collectively and with the particular determination of bureaucracies that have decided on denial, to claim that Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore were lying. The Daily Prophet, which served as the wizarding world's primary news source and which had always had an uncomfortably close relationship with the ministry, began a campaign of ridicule and destabilization against both Harry and Dumbledore that lasted throughout the academic year of 1995 to 96. Harry was portrayed as an attention-seeking liar, possibly disturbed, certainly unreliable, the beneficiary of Dumbledore's favoritism and his own unearned fame. Dumbledore was portrayed as an aging eccentric who had always been dangerously unorthodox, whose methods at Hogwarts had always been questionable, whose judgment was perhaps finally failing him. Professor Dolores Umbridge was installed at Hogwarts as High Inquisitor by the Ministry, and her campaign to undermine Dumbledore's authority and bring the school under Ministry control was one of the more naked examples of institutional overreach in wizarding political history, carried out with the particular relentlessness of someone who believes that rule following and cruelty are essentially the same thing. The educational decrees she enacted, the punishments she used, the systematic removal of any teaching that might have actually prepared students for what was coming, all of this took place in a school full of children who were watching the magical world organize itself in real time around a lie. Meanwhile, in the spaces that the ministry and the prophet couldn't see, Voldemort was consolidating. He was gathering his strength, rebuilding his network, recruiting Dementors away from Azkaban, and pursuing a specific objective that drove everything else in his plans for that year: the acquisition of the full prophecy. He had heard only the first portion 14 years before. He wanted the complete text, which was stored in the Department of Mysteries in the Ministry of Magic's headquarters, in a glass sphere labelled with his name and Harry's. He could not retrieve it himself. Only the subject of a prophecy could retrieve it, without their mind being destroyed. He needed Harry to get it for him, and so he engineered, through his connection to Harry via the scar and the piece of soul that lived there, a vision. Harry's godfather, Sirius Black, being tortured in the Department of Mysteries. The vision was false, a trap, and it worked. Harry led a group of 6 students, himself and Ron and Hermione, and Neville Longbottom and Luna Lovegood and Ginny Weasley, into the Ministry of Magic via a ministry fireplace, into the Hall of Prophecy, where they found the sphere but no Sirius, and they were then surrounded by 12 Death Eaters who had been waiting for them. What followed was a chaotic, exhausting, desperate fight through the Department of Mysteries, through the time room and the space room, and finally into the death chamber, where the veil hung on its ancient stone arch. That mysterious stone arch in the center of the chamber, with its tattered curtain, through which the voices of the dead could sometimes be heard if you listened. The Order of the Phoenix arrived to fight the Death Eaters, and in the confusion of that battle, the prophecy was destroyed, and Sirius Black fell through the veil. He fell with a look of surprise on his face through that curtain, and he did not come back. And Harry, wild with grief and fury, chased Bellatrix Lestrange through the ministry and attempted the Cruciatus curse on her in the atrium, and could not sustain it because, as Bellatrix told him through her wild, delighted laughter, he needed to mean it, really mean it, needed to want to cause pain for its own sake, which Harry did not. And then Voldemort himself arrived. In the Ministry of Magic's atrium, with the golden fountain of magical unity and its spray of enchanted water, Voldemort and Harry Potter faced each other. And the duel that followed was witnessed by Cornelius Fudge himself, who arrived with ministry officials and saw with his own eyes what he had spent a year insisting could not possibly be real. Voldemort fled, and the denial was over. In the next chapter, The Year of the Half-Blood Prince, you'll discover the devastating year of 1996 to 97, the year that Dumbledore finally told Harry the full truth about the Horcruxes, and the year that cost everything. You won't want to miss how the greatest wizard of the age prepared his greatest student for the impossible task ahead. The year that followed Voldemort's public reappearance in the atrium was not the year anyone expected. There was no sudden mobilization of the wizarding world into effective resistance. There was no unified response, no strategic military campaign, no mass conscription of wizarding talent into a coordinated defense. What there was, instead, was fear, confusion, and the particular paralysis that grips a community when it has spent a year refusing to prepare for what it was warned was coming, and now must face the consequences of that refusal. Voldemort, operating now without the need for concealment he had maintained while the Ministry was denying his existence, moved openly and aggressively. He broke into Azkaban and freed multiple Death Eaters. He recruited the Giants, enormous magical creatures who had long been marginalized and driven toward Voldemort's side by the Ministry's indifference to their welfare. He coordinated attacks across the country, attacks on Muggle infrastructure and on wizarding families. The wizarding world was in a state of open war, and it was losing. Against this backdrop, Albus Dumbledore finally told Harry Potter the truth, or as much of the truth as he was ready to tell. He showed Harry memories, a series of them accessed through the Pensieve, the silver bowl in which memories can be stored and revisited. The memories trace Tom Riddle's life, the life we have been following tonight, from the orphanage to Hogwarts, to the early years of his transformation. Dumbledore showed Harry Merope-Gaunt and her hopeless love and her terrible end. He showed him Marvolo and Morphin in their declining cottage. He showed him the young Tom Riddle, charming and dangerous and already fully formed as a predator. And eventually, he told Harry about the Horcruxes, about what they were and how they worked, and how many there might be, and what destroying them would mean for the possibility of destroying Voldemort. This was the information that restructured everything, that turned the war from a question of military confrontation into something more like a puzzle, a deeply dangerous, deeply personal puzzle, scattered across the wizarding world in objects that only Dumbledore had partially identified. The diary was already destroyed. Harry had done that in the Chamber of Secrets. The ring had been found by Dumbledore himself, who had located it in the ruins of the Gaunt family cottage and destroyed it with the Sword of Gryffindor. Though in doing so, he had inadvertently put his right hand in contact with the stone in the ring's setting, which had unleashed a curse that was at that moment killing him slowly from the inside. A curse that Snape had halted but could not reverse. The ring's stone, it would eventually emerge, was the Resurrection Stone, one of the 3 Deathly Hallows, but that knowledge was still ahead of them. There were more Horcruxes. Dumbledore had identified Slytherin's locket, which had been stolen from where Regulus Black had hidden it, as one. He had identified Helga Hufflepuff's cup as likely another, having traced it to Hepzibah Smith's collection before its disappearance after her death, in circumstances that pointed unmistakably to Tom Riddle. He believed there were likely 2 more objects of significance to Hogwarts and its founders, given Voldemort's obsession with Hogwarts as his spiritual home and his hunger to collect objects of power and history. And he believed there was the snake, Nagini, who had likely been made a Horcrux at some point, a living Horcrux, unprecedented and deeply personal, given Voldemort's connection to serpents. And then there was Harry, though Dumbledore did not tell him that yet. Did not tell him because Harry was not ready, and because Dumbledore was not entirely sure himself, though he suspected, with the quiet, terrible certainty of a great mind that has assembled enough evidence to see the shape of what it cannot yet prove, the scar, the link between their minds, the ability to see into Voldemort's thoughts and feel his emotions. These were not the normal side effects of a failed killing curse. They were the signature of a soul fragment that had taken up residence. The year of the Half-Blood Prince ended with the catastrophe at Hogwarts, the night Draco Malfoy let Death Eaters into the castle through a pair of vanishing cabinets, the night the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, and the night that Severus Snape, at Dumbledore's pleading insistence, cast the killing curse that ended Albus Dumbledore's life on the top of that tower. Snape was not a traitor in the way everyone believed him to be. Dumbledore had asked him to do it, had made him promise to do it, because the curse from the ring was killing him anyway, and he wanted to die on his own terms, without being murdered by Draco Malfoy, in a way that would complete the boy's corruption, and because Snape's continued credibility with Voldemort was too important a strategic asset to sacrifice on any other altar. He was Dumbledore's man. He had been Dumbledore's man since the moment he had understood what the prophecy he had overheard would cost, since the moment he had realized that the woman he had loved since childhood, Lily Evans Potter, was in danger, and had gone to Dumbledore and begged him to protect her. Dumbledore had not been able to save Lily, but he had given Snape the purpose of his subsequent life: protect her son, be the spy within the Death Eaters that no one else could be. And Snape had done it, for 16 years, at an unimaginable cost to himself. In the next chapter, The Horcrux Hunt, you'll discover what Harry, Ron, and Hermione endured in the year they spent outside the protection of Hogwarts, hunting the remaining Horcruxes across magical Britain. You won't want to miss the full account of that long, cold, isolated year. Picture 3 17-year-olds in a tent in the middle of a forest in early winter. The cold coming through the canvas walls, the silence enormous, the world they knew receding day by day into something they were no longer certain they could return to. This is what the Horcrux hunt looked like from the inside. Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger did not go back to Hogwarts in the autumn of 1997. Hogwarts was no longer safe, had been taken over by Snape as headmaster under Voldemort's authority, with the Carrows, Amicus, and Alecto as teachers whose pedagogical methods included the use of unforgivable curses on students as punishment. The three of them were carrying the locket of Slytherin, which they had stolen from Dolores Umbridge in a dangerous infiltration of the Ministry of Magic that had gone partially right and dramatically wrong, and they were moving from location to location under the protection of a disillusionment charm and a powerful set of defensive spells, camping in different spots each night to avoid detection. And they were trying to figure out how to destroy a Horcrux made of materials that resisted every ordinary means of destruction. An object that contained a fragment of Voldemort's soul was not merely magically robust. It was sustained by a life force that did not want to die and that would resist destruction with everything it had. The locket was the worst companion imaginable. Worn as it had to be around the neck of whoever was keeping watch, it exuded a dark influence, a slow-acting depression and irritability that ground down whoever was wearing it and made the isolation of the camp more claustrophobic and the silences more hostile. Ron, under the influence of the locket one night, when the weight of everything had become too heavy, said things he did not mean and disapparated into the darkness. And Harry and Hermione were left with each other and the locket and the cold and no clear plan. He came back weeks later, found them again by following the deluminator that Dumbledore had left him, and it was Ron who dove into a frozen pond to retrieve the sword of Gryffindor when a silver doe Patronus led Harry to it. And it was Ron who destroyed the locket with the sword when it opened and showed him, in the gleaming emptiness of its interior, his deepest fears given mocking form. The locket screamed when it died, and something left it like a sigh of corrupted air, and the second Horcrux was gone. The fourth, counting from the beginning, was gone. But there were still so many remaining. The cup of Hufflepuff, the unknown object connected to Ravenclaw, Nagini, and the one that could not yet be spoken of. The trio spent the winter moving through the cold British countryside, following the threads that Dumbledore had left them, pieces of information embedded in the objects he had bequeathed them, and in the stories he had never quite finished telling. Harry had the snitch that opened at the close and contained the resurrection stone. He had the deluminator that now seemed to have the ability to guide Ron back when he needed to find them. He had Hermione's brilliant, relentless intelligence and her expanded bag full of books and supplies and the full contents of the Hogwarts library that she had brought with her. And he had one more clue, one that came to him from the strangest source, from the rantings of a wandless, wild-haired old man called Xenophilius Lovegood, who told them the story of the 3 Deathly Hallows in a desperate attempt to buy time while his daughter Luna was held prisoner by Death Eaters at Malfoy Manor. The 3 Hallows, the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Cloak of Invisibility, the greatest magical objects in existence, the tools of the Master of Death. Dumbledore had known about them. Dumbledore had possessed them at various points, or their most significant components. And Voldemort was hunting the Elder Wand, the undefeatable wand, the one wand in the world that could guarantee his victory against Harry Potter. In the next chapter, The Elder Wand's Trail, you'll discover how Voldemort tracked the Elder Wand across Europe and what he was willing to do to claim its allegiance. You won't want to miss how the most powerful wand in history became both the key to his victory and the instrument of his undoing. The Elder Wand has the longest and bloodiest history of any object in the wizarding world, stretching back to the 3 brothers of the tale in Beedle the Bard. Those 3 brothers who met death at a crossroads and bargained with him, and the eldest asking for the most powerful wand in existence and being given one fashioned from elderwood, a wand that its owner would never lose in a duel. The wand did not make its first owner invincible, merely extremely formidable, and it passed from owner to owner, down through the centuries, always in the same way. The previous owner was defeated or killed by the next, because the wand's allegiance transferred only to the person who had overcome its previous master, regardless of whether that person took it physically or simply disarmed them. It had left a trail of deaths and legendary duels across European magical history, passing through Godolo and Loxias and Grigorovich, and eventually, in the 20th century, into the possession of Gellert Grindelwald, who stole it from Grigorovich by disarming him. And Grindelwald had been defeated in the legendary duel of 1945 by Albus Dumbledore, who had won the wand's allegiance without killing Grindelwald, leaving him alive in Nurmengard, the prison he had built for his enemies, where he had sat for 50 years, very old and very alone, with the consequences of what he had been. Voldemort went to Nurmengard in the winter of 1997 to 98. He went to get the Elder Wand because he was using the wand he had always used, the 13-inch U wand with the phoenix feather core, the twin of Harry's wand, and when those wand twins met, the priori incantatem effect meant he could never reliably kill Harry with his own wand. He needed another. He needed the best. He went to Grindelwald's cell, and he asked Grindelwald where the Elder Wand was. And Grindelwald, old and frail, and having apparently spent his decades of imprisonment in something approximating genuine remorse, refused to tell him. He taunted Voldemort instead, told him he would never know what Dumbledore possessed, that he was terrified of death, and Voldemort killed him and went to Dumbledore's tomb on the grounds of Hogwarts, and opened it and took the Elder Wand from Dumbledore's unresisting hands. He believed the wand was now his. He believed he had mastered it. He did not know, could not yet know, the crucial detail that would undo him. The Elder Wand's allegiance had not transferred to Snape when Snape killed Dumbledore, because Dumbledore had already been disarmed, already been overcome. On the night Draco Malfoy had lowered Dumbledore's wand and it had fallen from his hand. The wand's allegiance had transferred to Draco Malfoy that night, quietly, without violence, in the moment of that disarming. And Draco Malfoy had months later been disarmed in turn by Harry Potter at Malfoy Manor during the desperate escape from that place. The Elder Wand's allegiance was Harry Potter's. Voldemort did not know this. He would not know it until it was too late. In the next chapter, The Final Gathering, you'll discover the events leading up to the Battle of Hogwarts, the night everything came to its conclusion. Stick around, because everything we have traced tonight, every thread, every choice, every consequence, is about to be gathered into its final shape. They came from everywhere. The night of the 2nd of May, 1998. They came because the word had gone out through Dumbledore's army, and through the Order of the Phoenix, and through the families and the friends and the former students who had spent a year living under Voldemort's occupation of their world, and who had decided, in the way that people eventually decide after enough darkness, that they had nothing left to lose. They came to Hogwarts because Voldemort was coming to Hogwarts, because Harry Potter was inside it, because the last Horcrux inside the castle needed to be found, and the next to last confrontation needed to happen there, because Hogwarts was the place where it had all begun, and therefore, with the deep inevitability of well-constructed stories, it was the place where it would end. Neville Longbottom was there, having led the remnant of Dumbledore's army through a year of resistance and guerrilla action against the Carrows that had left scars on his face that he would carry all his life. Luna Lovegood was there, having escaped from Malfoy Manor months before, after a captivity that had changed her in ways she carried quietly. Professors McGonagall and Flitwick and Sprout were there, having spent the year maintaining what they could of Hogwarts under Snape's headmastership, without allowing themselves to be complicit in the worst of it. And the Weasley family was there. Every one of them, every red-haired, fierce-hearted member of the largest and most thoroughly decent family in the wizarding world was there. Fred and George setting up defences, with the kind of focused determination that turned their genius for mischief into something genuinely formidable. Bill and Fleur. Charlie, from Romania, with the Dragon Keepers who came with him. Arthur and Molly Weasley, standing in the hallway of the school that their 7 children had all attended and preparing to fight. The battle itself was chaotic and terrible and lasting, fought through corridors and classrooms and the grounds and the Forbidden Forest, with spells flashing across the darkness and figures falling, and the castle itself taking damage, stone crumbling and portraits fleeing their frames, and the suits of armour marching to join the defence at Professor McGonagall's command. Voldemort's army outside the walls included Death Eaters and Dementors, and giants and werewolves and spiders pouring out of the Forbidden Forest under the leadership of Aragog's descendants. And the army inside the walls had the advantage of knowing the territory and the disadvantage of being significantly smaller. During the battle, Harry was working through the castle, following the logic of the remaining Horcrux, which he had identified through a chance encounter with Helena Ravenclaw, the Grey Lady, as Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem of extraordinary wisdom, which had been hidden by Helena herself in the forests of Albania centuries before, and retrieved by Tom Riddle, when Riddle had visited Hogwarts as a young man, and charmed the truth from Helena, the same way he charmed truths from everyone. The diadem was in the room of requirement, hidden in the towering mountains of discarded objects that made up the room of hidden things. And Harry found it, and it was destroyed when Vincent Crabe, in a moment of catastrophic recklessness, cast fiend fire, and the room of hidden things became an inferno of dark, self-replicating fire that consumed the diadem and nearly consumed Harry and Ron and Draco Malfoy, who were there with him. And then there was Snape. Voldemort had retreated to the boathouse during the battle's first pause, and he had Nagini with him, Nagini, who was the final Horcrux, the living Horcrux, the snake coiled in her great enchanted cage of invisible protective magic, and he had Snape with him. And Voldemort, sitting in the boathouse with his elder wand and his certainty of victory, had thought through the question of why the elder wand was not performing as fully as he expected. He had concluded, following the wand lore he had researched, that the wand was not fully his because its previous master had not been fully defeated. Dumbledore had been killed by Snape, and Snape had never been overcome by Voldemort. Therefore, the wand's allegiance, by this logic, must still lie with Snape. This was wrong, as we know, because Voldemort had misunderstood the chain of mastery, but it was convincingly reasoned from faulty premises, and his conclusion was that to fully claim the Elder Wand, he needed to kill Snape. And so he did. He commanded Nagini to attack, and the snake's fangs opened Snape's throat, and Voldemort walked away, confident that the wand was now his. And Harry crouched over Snape in the last minutes of his life, and Snape pressed his memories into Harry's hands and looked at the eyes that were Lily Evans's eyes, and died having given everything. Harry took Snape's memories to the Pensieve, and he saw the truth. He saw the night Snape had overheard the prophecy and gone to Dumbledore in terror. He saw Dumbledore's bargain with him, protect Lily's son, protect Harry. He saw years of careful, excruciating service, the double life, the hatred of James Potter sublimated into a complicated relationship with Harry that was never simple and never kind, but that was always beneath the surface, keeping its promise. He saw Dumbledore telling Snape, in what he had believed was a confidence held for the right moment, that Harry was a Horcrux, that Harry must die, that Voldemort had to be allowed to kill Harry himself, because only Voldemort, using his own wand, casting the killing curse with the fragment of soul that lived in Harry as its target, could destroy that fragment without destroying Harry himself, or rather, could theoretically destroy it, because Dumbledore's understanding was that when Voldemort had used Harry's blood to restore himself in the graveyard, he had tied Harry's life to his own, had anchored Harry's survival in a way that might mean Harry could survive the curse, even if the soul fragment did not. It was a theory. Dumbledore had not been able to test it. He had left it for Harry to discover for himself at the last possible moment, because to have told Harry earlier would have been to ask him to carry the full weight of his own sacrificial death for years, and Dumbledore, for all his calculated planning, was not willing to do that. Harry closed the Pensieve. He went to Dumbledore's office, and he took out the snitch that opens at the close, and he put it to his lips, and it opened, and inside it was the resurrection stone, the stone from the gaunt ring that Dumbledore had hidden there. Harry turned it 3 times, and his parents came. His mother, Lily, exactly as he had always imagined her, exactly as the photographs he had kept showed her. His father, James, grinning at him the way photographs sometimes caught him. Sirius Black, looking young and free, in a way that the real Sirius never quite managed to look in the time Harry had known him. Remus Lupin, who had died in the battle that night, gentle and patient. They could not touch him. They were not the dead recalled to life. They were images, echoes, the nearest thing the stone could offer. But they walked with him out of the castle and through the grounds and into the forbidden forest. And they were with him when he dropped the stone on the forest floor and kept walking. He walked into the clearing where Voldemort was waiting with his Death Eaters and his snake. And he stood there without his wand raised, and Voldemort, who did not understand sacrifice and had never understood love, cast the killing curse, and the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had lived in Harry's scar for 16 years was destroyed, and Harry went somewhere else, somewhere white and clean and still, a place that resembled King's Cross Station without the grime, and Dumbledore was there, and they talked, and Harry chose to go back. In the next chapter, the last battle, you'll discover the final confrontation in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, the last duel between Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort, and why it ended the way it did. You won't want to miss how the logic of love and sacrifice, which ran through the entire story, finally declared itself in its full power. Harry Potter came back to life on the forest floor and was carried into Hogwarts as a corpse by Voldemort's procession, Hagrid carrying him with his enormous hands and his open, helpless grief, carrying him the way he had carried the 16-month-old baby from the ruins of Godric's Hollow 17 years before, completing a circle without knowing it. The sight of Harry's apparently dead body broke the defenders of Hogwarts like a wave breaking against a rock, a collective scream of grief and fury that shook the walls of the castle and brought the battle back to its worst intensity. Neville Longbottom, who had been captured and restrained, and who Voldemort was using as an object lesson in the futility of resistance, stood before Voldemort with his arms immobilized and his body held in a full body bind, and refused to recant anything. He refused to kneel. He stood there while the Sorting Hat was set on fire on his head, and he did not kneel. And then Harry fell out of Hagrid's arms, very much alive, and the chaos of the battle resumed. The final confrontation happened in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, the place where Harry had eaten his first Hogwarts feast, where he had watched the Tri-Wizard Champions be announced, where he had seen the enchanted ceiling reflect the weather of the sky outside. Now it was full of rubble, and the dead and the grieving and the fighters who had survived this far. And Voldemort was there, and Harry was there, and they circled each other as the people around them fell away to give them space, as the battle paused without instruction, as everyone understood that what was happening here was the center of everything. Harry talked to Voldemort. This is something people often remark upon, that Harry talked, that he explained, that he offered Voldemort a chance to repent, a chance that Dumbledore had always believed even a Voldemort could theoretically take if he truly chose to. Though the cost of genuine repentance for someone who had split their soul as many times as Voldemort had was so severe that it might be fatal. Harry told Voldemort about the Elder Wand. He explained the full chain of mastery. Dumbledore had been mastered by Draco. Draco had been mastered by Harry, and therefore the Elder Wand was Harry's. regardless of who was physically holding it. He told Voldemort that using the Elder Wand against its true master would mean it would not kill whom Voldemort intended. He told Voldemort all of this in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, with what felt like the entire wizarding world watching. Not because he expected Voldemort to listen, but because he needed to have said it. Because giving someone the truth, even someone who is beyond receiving it, is itself an act of human dignity. And Harry Potter was, in that moment, the fullest expression of what his mother's sacrifice had made him. A person incapable of the kind of cruelty that kills without offering an alternative. Voldemort did not listen. He cast the killing curse. Harry cast Expelliarmus, the disarming charm, the spell he had used in his very first successful duel at 12 years old, the spell his friends and allies had teased him for never abandoning, the spell that seemed too small and too simple for the magnitude of what it was being used against. The two spells met, and the Elder Wand, encountering the spell of its true master, turned the killing curse back on the caster. Lord Voldemort died, not with an explosion or a dramatic conflagration, not with the world cracking open, or the sky falling, or any of the operatic catastrophe his self-image would have demanded. He fell, slowly, like a man who has finally run out of everything that had been keeping him upright, and his body hit the ground, and he was human in his death. Just a human body, just a man who had lived and made his choices and arrived at their terminus. The red eyes closed, the white hands fell open. Tom Riddle, who had spent his entire life fleeing the inevitability of his own mortality, arrived at it on the floor of the Great Hall of Hogwarts on the morning of the 2nd of May, 1998. And there was nothing theatrical or grand about it. There was just the silence that follows the ending of a very long storm. In the next chapter, The Aftermath and the Shape of What Remained, you'll discover what the wizarding world looked like in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat, and what the costs of the two wizarding wars had ultimately been. You won't want to miss the full reckoning with what the darkness had taken. The morning after the battle arrived like all mornings after terrible things. Quietly, tentatively, the sun coming up over the forbidden forest as if asking permission. The light moving across the ruined grounds of Hogwarts and illuminating the work that remained to be done. The body of Fred Weasley lay in a corridor where he had fallen, still wearing the expression of someone who had just had a joke interrupted. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks had died within feet of each other, leaving behind a son less than a month old. 50 others were dead, defenders of Hogwarts and members of Voldemort's forces, witches and wizards and creatures whose deaths had been the price of everything. Colin Creevey was there, a 16-year-old Muggle-born boy who had been expelled from Hogwarts under Voldemort's regime, but who had come back that night anyway, too small to have been allowed in by the age restriction, too brave to have stayed away. His death was the kind of detail that told you everything you needed to know about the cost of the war and about who paid it. Imagine the weight of that morning, the particular weight of surviving a thing that has cost so many people their lives, the strange guilt of being present when others are not, the hunger that exhausts itself and then continues, the need to sleep mixed with the inability to close your eyes without seeing things. Harry Potter sat on a stone step somewhere in the castle that morning and held a wand that now belonged to him, the most powerful wand in history, and thought about what to do with it. He thought about it clearly and practically, and made a decision that was entirely consistent with every choice he had made throughout the story. He did not keep it. He repaired his own wand with it, the holly and phoenix feather wand that had cracked in the autumn, and then he planned to return it to Dumbledore's tomb, so that when he died, in the fullness of a long and ordinary life, the Elder Wand's power would die with him, undefeated, its chain of mastery ending peacefully. He used the resurrection stone only once and dropped it in the forest. He kept the cloak of invisibility, which was his father's and had been in his family, which had been given to him before his first year at Hogwarts in an anonymous parcel at Christmas, which had covered him and his friends in the warm dark of a dozen dangerous escapades. The cloak he kept. The trials that followed in the weeks and months after the battle were the second great reckoning, the legal and moral accounting that the wizarding world had avoided after the First War and could not avoid again. Death Eaters were tried. Some were convicted and sent to Azkaban. Others, in the complicated web of coercion and manipulation that Voldemort had always employed, had cases that were more nuanced, had participated under genuine imperious, or under threats to their families, or under pressures that diminished without eliminating their moral agency. The trial of Dolores Umbridge, who was not technically a Death Eater, but whose enthusiastic collaboration with the regime had resulted in the imprisonment and deaths of multiple Muggle-born witches and wizards, was watched with particular attention by a wizarding public that needed the catharsis of accountability, but was also learning, slowly, how complicated that catharsis was to achieve. The Malfoy family was a case study in the complexity of collaboration. Lucius Malfoy, a Death Eater by choice and conviction, who had served Voldemort through 2 wars and had been instrumental in countless deaths and suffering, escaped Azkaban partly on the basis of his family's last-minute switch of sides during the battle, partly on the testimony of Harry Potter himself, who confirmed that Narcissa Malfoy had saved his life in the forest by lying to Voldemort about whether he was dead. Harry Potter told the truth about this in court, and Narcissa Malfoy went free, and Lucius's sentence was significantly reduced. Harry Potter, who had lost more than almost anyone to the Death Eater's actions, giving testimony that saved a Death Eater's wife, was not something the Daily Prophet knew quite how to report. It was too human, too complicated, too unwilling to fit into the stories of pure heroism and pure villainy that the paper was most comfortable writing. Voldemort's soul, or what was left of it, was a more abstract question, and one that the wizarding world preferred to leave unaddressed. The fragments that had been in the Horcruxes were destroyed. The diary by Harry's basilisk fang in the Chamber of Secrets, the ring by Dumbledore's sword in the Gaunt Cottage, the locket by Ron's sword in the Winter Camp, the diadem by the Fiendfire in the Room of Requirement, the cup by Hermione's basilisk fang in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts, Nagini's head removed by Neville Longbottom's sword of Gryffindor in the final moments of the battle, and the piece in Harry's scar by Voldemort's own curse. 7 Horcruxes, all gone. The piece that remained in Voldemort's own body at the time of his death was the smallest, the most attenuated, the least of all those fragments. and what became of it after his death was something that no philosopher or magical theorist had a definitive answer to. What the wizarding world knew was that this was a soul so damaged, so deliberately, repeatedly violated and fractured by its own choices, that the question of what it became after death was perhaps unanswerable. Dumbledore had told Harry in the White Place between worlds that the small, wretched thing huddled under the seat was beyond help, and Harry had not tried to help it. He had left it there. In the next chapter, Legacy in the Ashes, you'll discover what Lord Voldemort's 2 wars left behind in the wizarding world, in its institutions and its culture and its people, and how the wizarding world rebuilt itself in the decades that followed. You won't want to miss the full accounting of what Voldemort's legacy truly was. We often measure the damage of a war in its dead, in the count of the fallen, in the list of names inscribed on memorial stones. The wizarding world had its memorial to the First and Second Wars. The statue in Godric's Hollow, first the one that concealed itself as a war memorial to Muggle eyes, then later a proper wizarding monument, and the list of the fallen that was eventually published by the Ministry of Magic after the Second War's end, 12 pages long, arranged alphabetically. The names of everyone from Lily and James Potter to Colin Creevey, to the unnamed victims of the First War's darkest campaigns. But the damage that is harder to measure, the damage that runs deeper than names on stone, is what a long period of terror does to the culture of a community, to the way it understands itself and treats the vulnerable among it. The most direct legacy of Voldemort's ideology in the wizarding world's institutions was the persistence of blood status prejudice in forms that had survived both wars largely intact. The systemic undervaluation of Muggle-born witches and wizards, the informal hierarchies of the old pureblood families, the way that certain ministry positions had remained essentially hereditary within a small set of families for generations, the discrimination against non-human magical creatures that had made it easy for Voldemort to recruit giants and werewolves and other marginalized beings to his cause. None of these things disappeared with Voldemort's death. The death of the Dark Lord did not transform the social structures he had exploited any more than the end of any ideology destroys the conditions that allowed it to flourish. What changed was the immediate terror, the daily threat of the dark mark appearing in the sky, the fear of speaking a name. What remained was the unfinished work of actually becoming the kind of society that Voldemort's ideology could not have taken root in. That work was the longer project, the one that would take not one decisive battle, but generations of choices, policy reforms, cultural shifts, the patient and unglamorous labor of building a more just community from the rubble of the old one. Kingsley Shacklebottom, who had been one of the Order of the Phoenix's most capable and principled members, became Minister for Magic in the aftermath of the Second War, and set about that labor with the clarity of a man who understood precisely what had been wrong and what needed to change. The Muggle-born Registration Commission was dissolved. The laws restricting the employment and civil rights of non-human magical beings were reviewed and revised. Aurors were retrained. The Dementors, who had abandoned Azkaban during the war to side with Voldemort, did not return to their role as prison guards. Instead, a new system of magical containment was eventually developed that did not require the services of creatures that spread despair as a byproduct of their existence. These changes were not dramatic. They were the kind of changes that happen in the background, that do not have the narrative clarity of a single climactic battle, that require sustained political will over years and decades. They happened anyway. Severus Snape was posthumously awarded the Order of Merlin, First Class, the highest honor in the wizarding world. Harry Potter insisted on it, gave public testimony about the full truth of Snape's role as Dumbledore's spy, and as the most deeply embedded agent in Voldemort's organization, and the wizarding world, which had spent 2 decades thinking of Snape as alternately suspect and treacherous, had to re-examine everything it thought it knew about him. This re-examination was uncomfortable and incomplete, and is probably still ongoing. The truth about Snape, as Harry understood it, was not that he was a hero in any simple sense. He had been deeply flawed, had made terrible choices as a young man, had carried bitterness and resentment in ways that made him cruel to children who deserved none of it. But he had also, from the moment of his love for Lily Potter and his horror at her fate, spent his subsequent life in service of a principle he had never betrayed, never once under conditions of almost unimaginable pressure and danger. His portrait was hung in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts, alongside all the other former headmasters, and it was there, eventually, when Harry's own children came to the school, the portrait of a thin, pale man with dark eyes, and the particular expression of someone who has had to be harder than they would have chosen to be. Harry Potter himself, in the years that followed, became an Auror, and eventually head of the Auror office, and in this capacity spent much of his working life doing the unglamorous work of rounding up the final Death Eaters who had escaped justice after the battle, the work of dismantling the organizational remnants of Voldemort's network, the work that is always required after the charismatic center of an authoritarian movement has been destroyed, the elimination of the mechanisms it left behind. He married Ginny Weasley. He had 3 children, and he named one of them Albus Severus, after the 2 headmasters who had most shaped his life, and who had both, in their very different ways, sacrificed everything for his survival. The name was a weight and a tribute and a choice made with full knowledge of what it meant, given to a child who would carry it into a wizarding world that was genuinely different, not perfect, not healed, but genuinely, structurally different from the one Voldemort had tried to build. In the next chapter, The Nature of the Monster, you'll discover the deeper question at the heart of this entire history. What was Lord Voldemort, really? What do we learn from tracing his life in full about the nature of power and fear and the choices that unmake a person? Stay with us, because this is the chapter where all the threads of this long story come together. There is a question that sits at the center of everything we have traced tonight. A question that is older than the wizarding world and older than magic. A question that every civilization that has ever produced a figure like Tom Riddle has had to face. Was he born what he became, or did he become it? Albus Dumbledore spent considerable time working through this question, and his answer, which he gave to Harry in various conversations over the years, was careful and nuanced and resistant to simplification. He did not believe in inevitable evil. He did not believe that Tom Riddle was destined from birth to become Lord Voldemort. that the circumstances of his conception, or his upbringing, or his heritage had sealed his fate before he had a chance to make a choice. What he believed was more complex, that Tom Riddle had been given very little by the world, and that from what very little he had been given, he had made very specific choices. Choices that were understandable in their origin, but that he had made freely, and that each choice had narrowed the available options for the next one, until the accumulation of choices had produced a person who had, for all practical purposes, placed himself beyond the reach of anything that might have changed his direction. The choices begin very early. Riddle's discovery that he had magical abilities led him almost immediately to weaponize them. This was not inevitable. There is nothing about having magical ability that requires a child to use it to hurt other children or terrify animals. Other children who had been in situations as difficult as his had made different choices with similar abilities. What Tom Riddle had, in addition to the magical gift and the difficult childhood, was a specific orientation toward other people, an orientation in which they were primarily instruments rather than ends, a tendency toward categorical thinking about his own specialness that left no room for genuine connection. Dumbledore's theory was that this orientation was at least partly connected to the circumstances of his conception, that a child born of magic, compelled rather than freely chosen love, might be constitutionally unable to access the kind of emotional openness that makes love possible. But Dumbledore was also careful to say that this was a theory, not a certainty, and that even if it were true, it made Tom Riddle's situation tragic rather than determined. Tragic because he lacked tools that others had. Determined would mean he had no agency, and Dumbledore was certain he had agency, certain he had made choices, because he had seen in that first memory of the 11-year-old boy in the orphanage bedroom a moment of something that might have been the beginning of a different path, a moment of real feeling, real vulnerability, real openness to the world Dumbledore was offering him. He had watched the boy close it down. He had watched him choose. The Horcruxes are the most revealing expression of Voldemort's essential nature, more revealing than his ideology or his rhetoric or his political organization, because they demonstrate with absolute clarity the thing he valued above all others: himself. Not his followers, not his cause, not the world he claimed to be building. Himself. The project of Horcrux creation was entirely solipsistic, a vast world-consuming effort to ensure the continuation of one particular consciousness, at any cost to any other person. Every murder that created a Horcrux was not, in Voldemort's internal accounting, a loss. It was a transaction, a life taken, a soul fragment secured, the project advanced. The reduction of other people to transactional value is the foundation of every atrocity in history. And Voldemort's version of it was simply particularly thorough and particularly magical. He had built a system for it. He had made it efficient. And in doing so, he had eliminated from himself everything that might have saved him. The ability to feel the weight of another person's existence as something real, as something that matters independently of what it can do for you. This is why he could not understand what happened at Godric's Hollow. He had spent years studying magic, had penetrated the mysteries of the killing curse and the dark arts more deeply than anyone since Herpo the Foul, had built a system of immortality so sophisticated that it had taken 7 years and the combined intelligence of Albus Dumbledore and Harry Potter to dismantle it. He had not studied love. He had not studied sacrifice. He had read about them, encountered them in the texts that discussed the protection of blood and the ancient magic of life freely given. But he had not understood them as real forces because he had never experienced them as real forces. They existed in a register of reality that he had sealed off from himself so thoroughly that it was not accessible to him, even theoretically. And so when Lily Potter stood between him and her son and would not move, he could not process what was happening. He could only interpret her refusal in terms he understood. She was being irrational. She was not thinking clearly. The situation would resolve itself and he would kill the child and continue. He could not see that what she was doing was the most powerful act in the room, more powerful than anything he was doing, more powerful than the Elder Wand and all 7 Horcruxes combined. He could not see it because seeing it would have required the capacity for the very thing she was doing, and that capacity he had traded away, one murder at a time, until there was nothing left in him that could recognize it. Harry Potter was, in many ways, the deliberate mirror image of Tom Riddle. The parallel was not accidental. Both were dark-haired boys who had grown up without family, without anyone to choose them, without the security of being loved. Both had arrived at Hogwarts from worlds that had not prepared them for what they found there. Both could speak parcel tongue. Both had wands containing feathers from the same phoenix, forks connected by that deep correspondence that the wand-maker Ollivander had always found remarkable. The Sorting Hat had considered putting Harry in Slytherin. These parallels were real and extensive and not coincidental. They were the structure of a story about what a person does with what they have been given, about whether the same raw materials of difficulty and power produce the same outcome, about whether Tom Riddle's path was inevitable or chosen. Harry's life was the argument that it was chosen. Harry, who had as much reason as anyone to become bitter and controlling and solitary, who had grown up in a cupboard under the stairs with people who told him repeatedly that he was worthless and unwanted, had consistently chosen differently, had chosen to let people in, to allow himself to be known, to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to give loyalty and receive it, had chosen, in the forest on the night of the battle, to walk toward death rather than run from it. The choice Voldemort had never been able to make, the choice of accepting mortality, of not clinging to existence at the cost of everything else, was the choice Harry made freely, and it was the choice that won. In the final chapter, From Tom Riddle to the Legacy of Love, we gather all the threads together. We look at the full arc of this story from the very beginning to the very end, and we rest in the quiet of what it all means. We began tonight in the 16th century, in a crumbling cottage on a hill in Little Hangleton, with a girl who was capable of love but not of receiving it, and a man who could not love her freely because his freedom had been taken from him. We began with a potion slipped into a cup, with a doomed marriage and a desperate birth on the last night of a year, with a child left on an orphanage doorstep on a cold December night, and a mother who did not survive to speak his name with tenderness. From that beginning, we have traced a life, and it is one of the darkest lives in the history of magic. The brilliant, loveless, pitiless intelligence that built itself upward from nothing, using only cunning and cruelty and a genius for understanding power, that reached the highest point available to it, and then exceeded that point through technologies of the soul that should never have been invented, that came so close to remaking the world in its own image that the alternative, the world we have been describing, the world where love survived and families grew back together, and mornings eventually arrived after terrible nights, feels not inevitable but miraculous. It is not, in any objective sense, a miracle. It is the consequence of choices, hundreds of them, made by dozens of people over decades. It is the consequence of Albus Dumbledore noticing a dangerous child and spending 40 years working against everything that child would become. It is the consequence of Lily Potter standing still in a room from which she could have run. It is the consequence of Peter Pettigrew, who owed Harry his life, hesitating for one crucial second in a cellar. It is the consequence of Narcissa Malfoy lying to protect her son. It is the consequence of Neville Longbottom, who did not kneel. It is the consequence of every member of the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army who showed up on the night of the 2nd of May, 1998, knowing what they were walking into. And it is, above all, the consequence of Harry Potter, who walked into a dark forest in the middle of a battle, armed with nothing but the knowledge that he was prepared to die for others, and who came back. Lord Voldemort's story is not primarily a story about evil, though evil is present in it in its most concentrated and most carefully considered form. It is a story about what happens when a person cuts themselves off from the thing that makes them human, about the precise mechanism by which the rejection of connection and mortality and love produces something that is not quite a person anymore, about how the pursuit of power in the absence of anything to use power for produces, eventually, only more power and less of the self that originally wanted it. Tom Riddle, who wanted to matter, who wanted to never be forgotten, who wanted proof that his existence was significant, spent his entire life creating a legacy of terror that ensured he would never be forgiven or forgotten, and in doing so destroyed the very thing that might have made his existence meaningful, which was the capacity to be moved by another person, to be changed by being loved. He was afraid of death because he had nothing to make death worthwhile. He clung to existence because existence was all he had. He created an empire of fear because fear was the only relationship he could sustain. And in the end, the empire crumbled and the fear receded, and a small boy with untidy hair and green eyes and a scar on his forehead grew up to have 3 children of his own, and he brought them to platform 9 3/4 and watched them board the Hogwarts Express. And the train moved away from the platform in a cloud of white steam, and the ordinary morning continued around it. And everything that had been paid for those children's ordinary morning was not forgotten, was never forgotten, but was held the way grief and gratitude are held together, folded into the tissue of a life that goes on. Harry Potter, who had carried a piece of Voldemort's soul in his own forehead for 16 years, and survived both having it and losing it, stood on the platform and watched the train disappear, and felt, whatever the word is for what you feel, when you are standing in a place that was bought with an impossible price, and the price is no longer visible, but you can feel where it went. He felt that. The story of Tom Riddle is finally a story about inheritance and choice, about what we are handed at birth and what we do with it, about whether the darkness that forms us is the darkness that defines us. Tom Riddle was handed an extraordinary amount of darkness and chose to become more dark than anything that had formed him. Harry Potter was handed nearly as much and chose differently again and again in the small moments that no one remembers and in the large ones that everyone does. The difference between them is not intelligence or magical ability or social advantage. The difference is that Harry Potter had people he loved and who loved him, people whose existence mattered to him more than his own survival, people for whom he was willing to walk into the Forbidden Forest in the dark. Voldemort had followers. Harry had friends. And in the end, that was everything. This has been the complete history of Lord Voldemort. From the crumbling, gaunt cottage to the fall on the floor of the Great Hall, from the boy born on a cold December night who was never held to the man who could not die until love killed him. It is a long story and a dark one, and there is something in the telling of it by candlelight, in the quiet of a night when the world outside is still, that makes the ending, the ordinary morning on the platform, the train full of children going to school, feel like exactly the kind of ending that was worth everything it cost. Thank you for journeying through this history with me tonight. If this narration lulled you towards sleep, drop a comment on how many nights you've joined us in a row. Sweet dreams. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter. The script is already complete. The previous output ended with the full outro sequence, including the sleep sign-off and the channel's fixed closing lines. The story reached its natural conclusion, with the final chapter gathering all threads. The wind-down reflection tracing the arc, from Tom Riddle's birth to Harry Potter on platform 9 3/4, the sleep sign-off and the verbatim channel outro. There are no remaining chapters or sections to continue into. If you would like, I can write an entirely new extended section that deepens specific chapters already covered, such as a more expansive treatment of the Death Eaters as individuals, or a fuller account of the First Wizarding War's timeline, or a deeper exploration of each individual Horcrux's history and destruction, adding the approximately 10,000 characters needed to reach the 150,000 character target. These would be inserted organically into the body of the script before the wind down, as additional numbered chapters, maintaining the same tone and structure throughout. Please confirm how you would like to proceed, and I will generate the additional content seamlessly. The wizarding world that emerged from the rubble of the Second Wizarding War was not simply the same world with one dangerous man removed from it. It was a world that had been stress-tested to its foundations, that had been shown every crack and every weakness in its institutions, every failure of moral courage in its leadership, every place where comfort and complicity had been allowed to substitute for principle. The rebuilding that followed was therefore not merely physical, not merely the restoration of damaged buildings and the filling of vacant ministry positions and the resumption of the Quidditch season. It was something far more demanding, the reconstruction of trust. Trust between the Muggle-born witches and wizards who had been systematically persecuted and the institutions that had failed to protect them. Trust between the half-blood families who had spent 2 wars being used as examples of contamination by one side and as afterthoughts by the other, and the mainstream of wizarding society that had never quite made room for them at the center. Trust between the magical creatures, the centaurs and the house elves and the goblins and the giants and the werewolves, who had been offered a choice between Voldemort's explicit contempt and the Ministry's polite neglect, and a wizarding world that was now, tentatively and imperfectly, beginning to understand that it could not build a just society on the labor and the silence of beings it refused to fully recognize. Hermione Granger, who had spent her entire magical education being reminded in various subtle and not so subtle ways that her Muggle parentage was a deficit, went to work at the Ministry of Magic after the war and eventually became Minister for Magic herself, decades later, and the reforms she enacted in that role were the most comprehensive restructuring of wizarding law since the establishment of the International Statute of Secrecy. She had carried, in her bottomless bag throughout the Horcrux hunt, not just books and supplies, but the understanding accumulating year by year since her first encounter with the treatment of house elves, that the wizarding world's deepest problem was not Lord Voldemort. Lord Voldemort was a symptom. The disease was the casual, normalized, institutionally reinforced belief that some magical beings mattered more than others, that some human beings mattered more than others. Voldemort had taken this belief to its logical and monstrous conclusion, and in doing so had made it impossible to ignore. Hermione's life's work was making it equally impossible to restore. Ron Weasley became an aura alongside Harry, and was, by all accounts, an exceptionally good one, possessed of a strategic intelligence that had always been underestimated, because it expressed itself through chess and jokes, rather than through the academic performance that the wizarding world recognized as intelligence. He had a gift for understanding how people thought, how they rationalized their choices, what they were protecting when they lied. These qualities made him invaluable in the work of dismantling the remnant networks of Voldemort's organization, the lesser Death Eaters and collaborators who had gone to ground after the battle and who were found, one by one, in the years that followed. He eventually left the Auror office to help his brother George run Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, because George needed him, and because Fred's absence had left a space in the shop and in George's life that no one else quite fit. And Ron understood that some obligations are more important than careers. Neville Longbottom, who had stood before Voldemort without flinching on the night of the battle, and had drawn the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat, and severed Nagini's head in a single stroke, destroying the last Horcrux and ending the last thread of Voldemort's protected existence, became a herbology professor at Hogwarts. He married Hannah Abbott, and they lived at the Leaky Cauldron for a time, Hannah eventually becoming its landlady, and Neville's classroom became one of the most beloved rooms in the castle, full of extraordinary plants and the particular warmth of a teacher who had himself been told he was not capable of the thing he turned out to be most capable of. His students never knew, most of them, the full weight of what their professor had done on the night they studied in history books. He did not tell them. But sometimes, on May the 2nd, the anniversary of the battle, he would go quiet in a particular way, and the older students understood not to ask. Luna Lovegood became a celebrated magizoologist, traveling to every corner of the world in search of creatures that other people did not believe existed, and finding many of them. She married a man named Rolf Scamander, grandson of the great Newt Scamander, whose own decades of work with magical creatures had laid the foundation for the field she now extended. She published her findings in the Quibbler, which her father, Xenophilius, had resumed publishing after his wartime imprisonment, and her work was regarded with a mixture of skepticism and fascination by the wizarding world that had always regarded Luna herself with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. She had the particular quality of someone who had survived terrible things, a captivity at Malfoy Manor during the darkest period of the war, and had emerged from it not harder but more thoroughly herself, as if the experience had burned away everything that was not essential, and left only the core, which was curiosity and kindness, and a complete inability to pretend that reality was different from what it was. Draco Malfoy's story in the aftermath of the war was one of the more quietly complicated ones. He had not been a Death Eater by conviction, so much as by inheritance and coercion, had been given a task by Voldemort, the assassination of Dumbledore, that he had been psychologically unable to complete, and had spent the year in which he was supposed to complete it, visibly deteriorating under the pressure of what was being demanded of him. He had not, in the end, identified Harry, Ron, and Hermione to the Death Eaters at Malfoy Manor when he had the opportunity to do so. He had hesitated. It was not heroism. It was the last remnant of something human in a boy who had been raised to be cruel and had found, in the extreme moment, that he could not be quite cruel enough. He spent the years after the war largely withdrawn from wizarding public life, eventually marrying a woman named Astoria Greengrass, who had her own complicated relationship with the ideology she had been raised around, and who had made her peace with it in a different way than Draco had. Their son, Scorpius, grew up hearing a different version of the Malfoy story than his father had been told. And whether Draco told it correctly, whether he managed to pass on the truth of what had happened and what it had cost, was something only his family knew. The monument that was eventually built to commemorate the victims of both wizarding wars stands in a square in Godric's Hollow, not far from where the cottage once stood, near the graves of Lily and James Potter, whose simple headstone reads the words from 1 Corinthians that Dumbledore chose for them. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Harry Potter visited that grave every year on the 2nd of May. He brought his children eventually, when they were old enough, and he tried to explain what the names meant and what had happened and why it mattered. And he found, as all parents find when they try to explain the worst of history to children who have inherited its consequences but not its memory, that the words were never quite adequate. What he could offer them, instead of words, was his presence there, his willingness to stand at the grave and feel the grief that had never fully departed and carry it, because carrying it was the way you honored the people whose sacrifice was the reason you were standing in the sunlight on a May morning, with children who did not yet fully understand what they had been given. Lord Voldemort had wanted immortality. He had wanted to be remembered forever, feared forever, his name spoken forever with terror, his shadow stretching across centuries. He achieved a version of this. His name is still spoken, still studied, still used as the reference point for the darkest possibilities of human ambition and magical power. But he is remembered not the way he intended, not as the unconquered, not as the master of death who could not be killed. He is remembered as the one who was defeated by love, by the ordinary and extraordinary love of a mother who would not step aside, by the loyalty of friends who kept their promises in the dark, by a boy who walked toward death because he chose people over himself. This was not the immortality Tom Riddle had planned. It was, in a way, the only immortality available to anyone, to have been part of a story larger than yourself, to have your choices ripple outward through other lives and other choices and other stories for as long as the story is told. Tom Riddle wanted to be the story. He became instead a chapter in someone else's, and that chapter was about everything he could not do, everything he could not take, everything love protected against him. The darkness did not die with its master. Evil doesn't die with its master. It evolves. It finds new vessels, new justifications, new languages in which to say the old things about who matters and who doesn't, about whose blood is clean and whose is not, about who deserves protection and who can be sacrificed. The wizarding world knew this in the years after the war, in the way that all communities know it after surviving something that should never have been possible. They knew it the way you know a scar, not as an abstract fact, but as a physical presence, a reminder written on the body of something that was broken and healed, and is not quite the same as it was before. The work was never finished. It was never meant to be finished. The work is the ongoing choice made in each generation, in each individual, in each moment, when the comfortable lie is available and the harder truth requires something of you. The work is choosing, again and again, what Tom Riddle chose never to choose. It is the work of staying human. And so we come to rest at last in the quiet of what this long story has always been about, from the crumbling cottage of the Gaunts to the platform at King's Cross, where the Hogwarts Express waits in its cloud of white steam, from the cold December night when Merop Gaunt died, having given her son only a name, to the May morning when Harry Potter stood with his own children and knew without adequate words for it what they had been given. From Tom Marvolo Riddle, who rearranged the letters of his name to declare himself a lord, to the boy who lived, who let his name mean something else entirely. The shadow stretched across a century. The light, in the end, was longer. Thank you for journeying through all of this with me tonight. If tonight's story lulled you towards sleep, drop a comment on how many nights you've joined us in a row. Sweet dreams. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.